Welcome back to Sleep 2 RPG, where epic gaming lore meets peaceful rest. Tonight we journey into the world of Final Fantasy VII to explore one of gaming's most profound and mysterious concepts, the life stream. Over the next several hours, we'll uncover the true nature of this ethereal force that flows beneath the planet's surface, discover how it connects all living things, and examine how its misunderstanding led to the madness of one of gaming's greatest villains, Sephiroth. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin this adventure together into the very soul of the planet itself. Chapter 1. The Essence of All Life. To understand the tragedy of Sephiroth and the cosmic horror that unfolds in Final Fantasy VII, we must first comprehend the life stream itself. Picture, if you will, a vast network of luminous green energy flowing like rivers beneath the surface of the planet Gaia. This is the life stream, not merely a source of power, but the very essence of life itself. A spiritual circulatory system that connects every living being on the planet in an endless cycle of existence, death, and rebirth. The concept of the life stream was one of the earliest ideas envisioned for Final Fantasy VII, born from director Hironobu Sakaguchi's personal experiences with mortality. When his mother passed away while he was working on Final Fantasy III, Sakaguchi found himself wrestling with profound questions about life and death. He wanted to explore the theme of life in what he called a mathematical and logical way to overcome the mental shock of loss. This deeply personal inspiration would become the philosophical foundation upon which the entire Final Fantasy VII narrative was built. Imagine the life stream as streams of green-white luminescence flowing through underground channels, carrying within its currents the memories, emotions, and knowledge of every soul that has ever lived. When viewed from the planet's surface, these streams appear as ethereal bands of light, sometimes visible during times of great disturbance or when the planet itself is wounded. The life stream is not simply energy, it is consciousness, experience, and wisdom made manifest in spiritual form. Within this cosmic river flow the essence of countless lives. Every being that has ever drawn breath on the planet Gaia contributes to this vast repository of existence. When death comes, as it inevitably must to all living things, the soul does not simply cease to exist. Instead, it joins the life stream, bringing with it all the experiences, love, pain, and knowledge accumulated during life. In this way, death becomes not an ending, but a transformation, a return to the source from which all life springs. The planet itself uses portions of this life stream to create new life. Like a cosmic garden where seeds of consciousness are planted and nurtured, the life stream provides the spiritual energy necessary for new souls to manifest. This creates an eternal cycle. Life emerges from the life stream, experiences existence in physical form, then returns to the life stream upon death, enriching it with new experiences and wisdom. In this way, the planet learns and grows through the lives of its inhabitants. But the life stream is more than just a repository of souls. It possesses a form of sentience, a planetary consciousness that some refer to as the will of the planet itself. This consciousness manifests through an entity known as Minerva, who appears to represent the planet's desires and judgments. Through Minerva, we see that the planet is not a passive vessel, but an active participant in the cosmic drama that unfolds upon its surface. The visual representation of the life stream varies depending on its state and purpose. When flowing peacefully beneath the planet's surface, it appears as gentle streams of green and white light. When called forth in times of great need, it can manifest as brilliant fountains of energy erupting from the earth. When corrupted or tainted, it takes on darker hues, becoming something sinister and threatening to the natural order. This ethereal substance that the inhabitants of Gaia have learned to harness in various forms serves multiple purposes beyond its spiritual significance. When the life stream crystallizes under certain conditions, it forms materia, small, glowing orbs that can be equipped to weapons and armor to grant magical abilities. These crystallized fragments of the planet's soul allow individuals to channel elemental forces, heal wounds, or even manipulate time and space in limited ways. The liquid form of the life stream, known as Mako, glows with an intense green radiance and can be harvested as an energy source. This discovery would prove to be both a blessing and a curse for the world of Final Fantasy VII, as it enabled tremendous technological advancement, while simultaneously threatening the very foundation of life on the planet. To truly appreciate the magnitude of what the life stream represents, consider that it contains not just the essence of human souls, but the spiritual energy of all life that has ever existed on Gaia. Every flower that has bloomed, every animal that has roamed the plains, every consciousness that has contemplated its existence, all become part of this vast, flowing tapestry of existence. The life stream is, in the most literal sense, the soul of the planet itself. This understanding makes the events of Final Fantasy VII all the more tragic. For what we witness is not simply the story of a corporation exploiting natural resources, but the systematic draining of the planet's very soul. Every drop of Mako extracted, every piece of materia harvested, represents a portion of the life stream being removed from its natural cycle. The planet is not just being mined for energy, it is being slowly but surely drained of its life force, its memories, its accumulated wisdom. The life stream also serves as a form of planetary immune system. When the planet faces threats that could endanger its existence, the life stream can manifest defensive mechanisms known as weapons. These massive biomechanical entities, each named after a precious stone, emerge when the planet senses mortal danger. They are not creatures in the traditional sense, but rather extensions of the planet's will, designed to eliminate threats to the life stream's integrity. Understanding the life stream also requires grasping its temporal aspects. Within its flowing currents, time becomes fluid. Past, present, and future blend together in ways that transcend normal understanding. This is why beings with strong connections to the life stream, such as the Cetra, sometimes possess prophetic abilities or can perceive events across time. The life stream exists partially outside the normal flow of time, containing echoes of what was and whispers of what might be. The relationship between consciousness and the life stream is perhaps its most fascinating aspect. While physical death marks the end of bodily existence, consciousness persists within the life stream. However, this persistence comes with a price. Over time, individual identities tend to merge with the greater whole. Memories blur together, personal experiences become part of the collective knowledge, and the self gradually dissolves into the larger tapestry of existence. Yet there are exceptions to this rule. Beings with exceptionally strong wills or deep connections to the life stream can maintain their individual consciousness for extended periods. They can even, under certain circumstances, project their awareness back into the physical world. This ability becomes crucial to understanding both Aerith's actions after her death and Sephiroth's continued influence throughout the Final Fantasy VII saga. The life stream also possesses healing properties on a planetary scale. When the world is wounded, whether by natural disasters, magical catastrophes, or artificial intervention, the life stream naturally flows toward the injury to repair the damage. This healing process can take many forms, from the gradual restoration of damaged ecosystems to the dramatic emergence of new landforms where destruction once reigned. This healing aspect of the life stream becomes central to Sephiroth's ultimate plan. By understanding that the planet would gather massive amounts of life stream to heal a severe wound, he conceives a scheme to position himself at the center of such a gathering. If he could absorb even a fraction of the concentrated lifestream energy, he would gain power beyond mortal comprehension, power sufficient to transcend his current existence and become something approaching a god. The lifestream's influence extends beyond the purely spiritual realm into the physical world in numerous ways. Areas where the lifestream flows close to the surface often exhibit unusual properties. Enhanced plant growth, strange weather patterns, or unusual concentrations of wildlife. These locations become sacred sites to those who understand the lifestream's nature, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. As we delve deeper into the mysteries of the lifestream, we begin to understand why its discovery and exploitation would set in motion the events that define Final Fantasy VII. This is not simply a tale of environmental destruction or corporate greed, though those elements are certainly present. It is a story about the violation of something sacred, the commodification of the soul itself, and the terrible consequences that arise when humanity's hunger for power exceeds its wisdom. The lifestream represents hope and tragedy in equal measure. It offers the promise of eternal continuation, the comfort that death is not an ending but a transformation. Yet it also reveals the fragility of existence, showing how easily the delicate balance that sustains all life can be disrupted by those who lack understanding or restraint. In the flowing green currents of the lifestream, we see reflected humanity's greatest dreams and darkest fears. The dream of transcending mortality, of becoming one with something greater than ourselves. The fear of losing our individual identity, of being consumed by forces beyond our control. These themes resonate throughout Final Fantasy VII, manifesting in different ways through different characters, but always returning to this central concept of the lifestream as both source and destination of all existence. Chapter 2. The Cetra, Shepherds of the Planet's Soul. Long before the gleaming towers of Midgar pierced the sky, before the Shinra Electric Power Company began its systematic exploitation of the planet's life force, there existed a people who understood the true nature of the lifestream. They were called the Cetra, though history would remember them by a simpler name, the Ancients. These remarkable beings possessed an innate connection to the planetary consciousness that allowed them to communicate directly with the lifestream, to understand its needs, and to serve as shepherds of the planet's spiritual ecosystem. The Cetra were not merely another race of humanoids who happened to develop magical abilities. They were something far more profound, a species that had evolved in harmony with the planet's consciousness, developing a symbiotic relationship with the lifestream that defined every aspect of their existence. To be Cetra meant to live with constant awareness of the planet's emotional state, to feel its joys and sorrows as intimately as one might feel their own heartbeat. This connection manifested in ways that would seem miraculous to ordinary humans. The Cetra could hear the planet speaking, not in words, but in impressions, emotions, and visions that conveyed meaning beyond the limitations of language. They described this communion as talking to the planet, a simple phrase that encompassed a form of communication so fundamental that it shaped their entire worldview. Through their connection to the lifestream, the Cetra gained abilities that allowed them to serve as caretakers of the world's natural systems. They could encourage plant growth, purify contaminated soil, and guide the flow of natural energies to maintain ecological balance. Where they walked, barren land would bloom, poisoned waters would clear, and the natural harmony of the world would be restored. The Cetra were nomadic by nature, but this wandering was not random or aimless. They followed the currents of the lifestream, moving across the planet as the spiritual energy ebbed and flowed through underground channels. Their migrations served a purpose beyond simple survival. They were following the planet's needs, traveling to locations where their intervention could restore balance or prevent ecological disaster. This nomadic lifestyle created a culture unlike any other on Gaia. The Cetra developed no permanent cities, built no lasting monuments to their civilization. Instead, they lived in harmony with the natural world, creating temporary settlements that would be abandoned without regret when the Lifestream's currents called them elsewhere. Their legacy was not found in stone or metal, but in the restored forests, purified rivers, and balanced ecosystems they left in their wake. The relationship between the Cetra and the Lifestream was reciprocal. While they drew power from their connection to the planetary consciousness, they also contributed to it through their experiences and wisdom. Each Cetra life enriched the Lifestream not just through their eventual death and return to the spiritual realm, but through their ongoing communion with the planet during life. They served as conscious nodes in a vast network of planetary awareness, extending the reach of the planet's consciousness into the physical world. Among the Cetra, certain individuals developed particularly strong connections to the Lifestream, becoming conduits for the planet's will. These spiritual leaders could perceive vast networks of cause and effect, understanding how events in one part of the world might influence conditions thousands of miles away. They became the guides who directed their people's migrations, the healers who could channel the planet's restorative power, and the guardians who protected the natural order from threats both internal and external. The Cetra's understanding of life and death differed fundamentally from that of ordinary humans. To them, death was not an ending, but a graduation, a transition from active service on the physical plane to integration with the Lifestream's eternal consciousness. This perspective gave them a serenity in the face of mortality that others found both admirable and unsettling. They grieved for the dead, not as lost souls, but as beloved companions who had moved on to a different form of existence. This philosophical framework extended to their views on violence and conflict. The Cetra were not pacifists in the absolute sense, but they understood that every act of violence created ripples in the Lifestream, disturbing the planet's spiritual equilibrium. When force became necessary, they approached it with deep reluctance and careful consideration of the long-term consequences. They fought not to destroy their enemies, but to restore the balance that had been disrupted. The Cetra's connection to the Lifestream also granted them remarkable longevity. While not immortal, they aged far more slowly than ordinary humans, with some individuals living for centuries while maintaining their vitality and mental acuity. This extended lifespan allowed them to accumulate vast knowledge about the planet's history and the subtle patterns that governed its spiritual ecosystem. As custodians of the planet's well-being, the Cetra developed sophisticated understanding of the relationships between different forms of life. They could perceive the spiritual connections that linked all living things, seeing how the health of a forest might depend on the migration patterns of certain animals, or how changes in mineral distribution could affect the growth of plant communities hundreds of miles away. This holistic perspective made them incredibly effective as planetary healers, but it also made them sensitive to disturbances that others might not even notice. The Cetra's culture emphasized collective responsibility over individual achievement. They understood that their abilities came not from personal merit, but from their species' fortunate evolution in harmony with the Lifestream. This humility prevented the development of the kind of hubris that would later characterize those who sought to exploit the planet's resources for personal gain. Their knowledge of the Lifestream extended to understanding of what lay beyond the normal cycles of death and rebirth. The Cetra spoke of a promised land, not a physical location, but a state of being where consciousness could exist in perfect harmony with the planet's will. This promised land represented the ultimate goal of spiritual evolution, a condition where individual awareness could merge with planetary consciousness without losing its essential nature. The concept of the promised land would later be misunderstood and corrupted by those who viewed it through the lens of material desires. To outsiders, particularly the profit-driven minds at Shinra, the Promised Land became a mythical place of unlimited resources and endless prosperity. They failed to understand that the Cetra's Promised Land was not a location to be found and exploited, but a state of spiritual development to be achieved through wisdom and service. As the Cetra continued their endless migrations across the planet, they left behind subtle signs of their passing. These were not monuments to their civilization, but markers that other Cetra could read, indications of the life stream's condition in various regions, warnings about potential dangers, or guidance about beneficial locations for meditation and communion with the planet. To untrained eyes, these signs appeared to be nothing more than natural formations or random arrangements of stones and plants. The Cetra's relationship with the life stream also influenced their approach to technology. They developed tools and techniques that worked in harmony with natural forces rather than opposing them. Their healing arts, for example, involved channeling the planet's own restorative energies rather than applying external remedies. Their agriculture encouraged the natural fertility of the soil rather than forcing it to produce through artificial means. This harmony-based approach to development meant that Cetra civilization left virtually no negative impact on the environment. They took only what they needed, used resources in ways that enhanced rather than depleted natural systems, and moved on before their presence could disrupt local ecological balances. In many ways, they represented an ideal form of civilization, one that enhanced the world rather than consuming it. The Cetra's understanding of the life stream extended to knowledge of threats that could endanger the planet's spiritual ecosystem. They could sense disturbances in the flow of spiritual energy, detecting the presence of entities or forces that did not belong to Gaia's natural order. This sensitivity would prove crucial when an alien threat arrived that would challenge everything they understood about life and death. Through their communion with the life stream, the Cetra also gained insight into the planet's deep history. They could access memories preserved in the spiritual currents, learning about events that had occurred long before their own time. This gave them perspective on the vast cycles of change that governed planetary development, helping them understand their role in the larger patterns of cosmic evolution. The Cetra's children were born with varying degrees of connection to the life stream. Some inherited the full range of abilities that define their people, while others showed only limited sensitivity to planetary consciousness. This variation was not seen as a deficiency, but as part of the natural diversity that strengthened their community. Those with weaker connections often served as bridges between the Cetra and other forms of life, helping to maintain harmony between their people and the creatures they encountered in their travels. As generations passed, some Cetra began to question whether their nomadic lifestyle was truly necessary. They wondered if they might serve the planet more effectively by establishing permanent settlements where they could develop more sophisticated techniques for channeling the life stream's power. This philosophical debate would eventually lead to a crucial decision that would reshape the planet's future. The choice to abandon the traditional nomadic way of life was not made lightly. Those Cetra who chose to settle in permanent communities gradually lost their connection to the life stream as they became focused on maintaining their fixed locations rather than following the planet's spiritual currents. Over time, these settled Cetra evolved into ordinary humans, gaining independence from planetary consciousness, but losing the abilities that had defined their ancestors. This transformation from Cetra to human represented both loss and liberation. The descendants gained freedom to pursue their own desires without being bound by the planet's needs. But they also lost the wisdom and perspective that came from constant communion with the life stream. They became capable of both great creativity and terrible destructiveness, no longer guided by the planetary consciousness that had kept their ancestors in harmony with the natural order. The remnant Cetra who maintained their traditional lifestyle watched this transformation with mixed emotions. They understood it as a natural part of the planet's evolution, but they also recognized the dangers it represented. Without the guidance of planetary consciousness, humans would be capable of actions that could threaten the very foundation of life on Gaia. Chapter 3. The Calamity from the Skies. In the peaceful cycles of the Cetra's wandering stewardship, few could have imagined the cosmic horror that would fall from the depths of space to shatter their harmonious world. It came not as a conventional invader with armies and weapons, but as something far more insidious, a parasite of consciousness itself, a being that would later be known by many names: the Calamity from the Skies, the Crisis from the Sky, Heaven's Dark Harbinger, and most simply, Jenova. 2,000 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII would unfold, this extraterrestrial entity crashed into the planet's northern regions, arriving in a meteorite that carved a massive crater into the Earth. But Jenova was no mere alien visitor seeking a new home. It was something far more dangerous, a cosmic predator that had likely destroyed countless worlds before setting its terrible gaze upon Gaia. The true horror of Jenova lay not in any conventional form of physical threat, but in its nature as a master of deception and psychological manipulation. This creature possessed abilities that struck at the very foundation of consciousness and identity. It could perfectly mimic the appearance, voice, and mannerisms of any being it encountered, creating illusions so complete that even those with the strongest connections to the lifestream could be deceived. Jenova's mimicry went beyond mere shapeshifting. It could access the memories and emotions of its targets, appearing to them as beloved figures from their past, deceased family members, lost friends, or idealized versions of themselves. This psychological warfare proved devastatingly effective against beings whose culture was built on trust and communal connection. How could the Cetra, accustomed to sensing truth through their communion with the planet, defend against an entity that could perfectly counterfeit even the most intimate memories? The alien's method of infection was as horrifying as its powers of deception. Jenova carried within its cells a form of viral contamination that could rewrite the very essence of living beings. Those exposed to this alien influence found their connection to the lifestream corrupted, their perception of reality distorted, and their bodies gradually transformed into monstrous forms that served Jenova's will. The infection process began subtly, with victims experiencing what seemed like enhanced abilities or deeper insights. Jenova would appear to them in the guise of a benefactor, offering knowledge or power that appeared to fulfill their deepest desires. Only gradually did the true cost of this alien gift become apparent as the infected began to lose their individual identity and become extensions of Jenova's consciousness. For the Cetra, whose entire existence was built around communion with the planet's life force, this corruption represented something worse than death. Jenova's influence severed their connection to the lifestream, while simultaneously preventing them from achieving the natural transition into the spiritual realm that marked the end of life. They became trapped in a horrifying state between life and death, neither truly alive nor able to find peace in the planet's embrace. The aliens' assault on the Cetra civilization began with infiltration rather than open warfare. Jenova would approach Cetra communities in the guise of one of their own, perfectly mimicking their appearance and mannerisms while carrying the viral contamination that would slowly spread through the population. By the time the deception was discovered, entire communities had been infected, their spiritual connections corrupted beyond repair. Those Cetra who resisted the initial infection found themselves facing enemies who wore familiar faces and spoke with beloved voices. Jenova could force the infected to appear as the resistors' own family members, creating psychological torment that was often more devastating than any physical assault. How could they fight against creatures that appeared to be their own children, their parents, their closest friends? The war between the Cetra and Genova was unlike any conflict in the planet's history. It was not merely a battle for territory or resources, but a struggle for the very nature of consciousness itself. Genova sought not just to conquer Gaia, but to transform it into an extension of its own alien awareness. Every being infected with its viral influence became a node in a vast network of alien consciousness, slowly but surely converting the planet's life force to serve Genova's unknowable purposes. The Cetra's connection to the life stream, which had always been their greatest strength, became both weapon and vulnerability in this cosmic war. Through their link to planetary consciousness, they could sense Genova's presence as a fundamental wrongness, a discord in the natural harmony of existence. This awareness allowed them to detect the alien's influence, even when it wore perfect disguises, but it also made them more susceptible to the psychological trauma of witnessing their world's corruption. As the conflict progressed, the surviving Cetra developed desperate strategies to contain Genova's influence. They learned to create barriers of spiritual energy that could temporarily hold back the alien contamination, buying time for uninfected populations to escape. They discovered that areas with particularly strong connections to the life stream could resist Genova's corruption longer than others, leading to a desperate retreat to these sacred sites. The planet itself seemed to recognize the existential threat that Genova represented. The life stream began to behave erratically, with massive surges of energy erupting in areas where the alien influence was strongest. These planetary convulsions created new geographical features, buried infected regions under layers of ice and stone, and generally reshaped the world's surface in an apparent attempt to contain the spreading contamination. Despite their heroic efforts, the Cetra found themselves fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to learn and adapt from every encounter. Genova's viral influence continued to spread, corrupting not just conscious beings, but the very environment itself. Plants and animals exposed to the alien contamination became twisted mockeries of their former selves, creating a spreading zone of wrongness that defied all natural law. The final phase of the war saw the surviving Cetra making the ultimate sacrifice to save their world. Recognizing that they could not completely destroy Genova, the alien's cellular structure proved remarkably resilient to all their efforts. They instead chose to contain it. Using their remaining connection to the life stream, they channeled the planet's power to create a prison of crystallized spiritual energy, entombing Genova in the northern crater where it had first landed. This containment came at a terrible cost. The ritual required the Cetra to pour their own life force into the barrier, essentially sacrificing themselves to maintain Genova's prison. One by one, the last guardians of the planet's spiritual ecosystem gave their lives to ensure that the alien threat would remain dormant, leaving behind only a handful of survivors to carry on their legacy. The effort to contain Genova also had lasting effects on the planet itself. The massive expenditure of spiritual energy required for the prison disrupted the natural flow of the life stream in the northern regions, creating geographical anomalies that would persist for millennia. The area around Genova's crater became a wasteland where the normal cycles of life and death were disrupted, a permanent scar on the planet's surface that served as a monument to the cosmic horror that lay trapped beneath. In the aftermath of this catastrophic war, the few surviving Cetra faced a changed world, their numbers reduced to a handful of individuals, their connection to the life stream permanently damaged by the trauma of Genova's influence. They could no longer serve as effective shepherds of the planet's spiritual ecosystem. The age of Cetra dominance was over, leaving the world to be inherited by their settled descendants who had become fully human. The knowledge of Genova's existence gradually faded from collective memory as the generations passed. The humans who inherited the world retained only fragmentary legends about the Cetra and their connection to the planet. The true nature of the threat that had once threatened all life on Gaia became myth, then folklore, then was forgotten entirely by all but a few scholars who dismissed such stories as primitive superstition. Yet beneath the ice and stone of the northern crater, Genova remained. The alien entity was not truly dead, merely dormant, its consciousness locked in a state of hibernation, while its cellular structure remained viable. The prison created by the Cetra's sacrifice held firm for 2 millennia, but it was not intended to last forever. The barriers weakened gradually over time, allowing minute traces of Genova's influence to seep into the surrounding environment. These subtle emanations had no immediate visible effect, but they created a slow, almost imperceptible corruption of the natural order in the northern regions. Strange mutations began to appear in local wildlife, and the area developed a reputation for producing individuals with unusual abilities or disturbing psychological profiles. Most dismissed these anomalies as products of the harsh environment or genetic isolation, never suspecting that they were witnessing the first signs of an ancient evil stirring to wakefulness. The planet itself seemed to sense Genova's gradual awakening. Seismic activity increased in the northern regions, and the flow of the life stream became increasingly erratic in areas surrounding the crater. These signs might have warned a civilization with proper understanding of the planet's spiritual ecosystem, but humanity had lost the knowledge necessary to interpret such warnings. Chapter 4: The Shinra Electric Power Company, commodifying the sacred. In the bustling metropolis of Midgar, built in the shadow of 8 massive reactors that pierce the sky like mechanical prayers to progress, few citizens understand the true nature of the energy that powers their world. The green glow that emanates from every reactor, the Mako energy that lights their homes and drives their machines, represents nothing less than the industrialized harvesting of souls. The planet's life force converted into a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed without regard for the spiritual devastation such exploitation creates. The Shinra Electric Power Company rose to prominence not through conventional business acumen alone, but through the discovery and monopolization of an energy source unlike any other in human history. When Shinra scientists first learned to extract and refine the liquid form of the life stream, they believed they had found the key to unlimited prosperity. They could not have imagined that their breakthrough would set in motion events that would threaten the very foundation of existence on their world. The company's founder and his successors built their empire on a fundamental misunderstanding of what they had discovered. To them, Mako was simply an incredibly efficient energy source, clean burning, highly concentrated, and apparently inexhaustible. They saw the brilliant green liquid as nature's gift to human ingenuity, a resource waiting to be harvested by those clever enough to develop the necessary technology. The spiritual significance of what they were extracting never entered their calculations. President Shinra, the ruthless patriarch who transformed a modest energy company into a global power, embodied the kind of aggressive capitalism that views the natural world as a collection of resources to be exploited, rather than a living system to be respected. Under his leadership, Shinra expanded from a local utility company into a mega corporation that wielded economic and military power, rivaling that of sovereign nations. The company's reach extended into every aspect of human civilization: energy production, weapons manufacturing, space exploration, genetic research, and military contracting. The construction of Midgar represented the apotheosis of Shinra's vision, a city built as a monument to technological achievement and corporate power. The metropolis was designed around 8 Mako reactors that formed the foundation of both its energy grid and its social structure. Above the reactors sprawled the upper city, where Shinra executives and their privileged employees enjoyed lives of luxury and technological convenience. Below, in the shadow of the great metal plate that supported the upper city, the poor and disenfranchised eked out existences in the slums, breathing polluted air and drinking contaminated water while the company's reactors continued their relentless extraction of the planet's life force. This stark division between the upper city and the slums served as a perfect metaphor for Shinra's relationship with the planet itself. Like the wealthy citizens who lived above, insulated from the consequences of their lifestyle by layers of metal and concrete, Shinra's leadership remained willfully ignorant of the true cost of their success. They enjoyed the benefits of Mako energy without witnessing the barren wastelands left behind by their extraction processes, the ecosystems that withered and died when the life stream was drained from the surrounding area. The technology of Mako extraction required massive industrial facilities that could penetrate deep into the earth to tap the streams of life stream flowing beneath the surface. These reactors were marvels of engineering, but they operated on principles that would have horrified anyone with true understanding of what they were doing. Each reactor was essentially a massive vampire, latching onto the planet's circulatory system and draining its life force for human convenience. The process of refining raw life stream into usable Mako involved techniques that were as spiritually destructive as they were technically impressive. The company's scientists learned to separate the spiritual energy from its memories and consciousness, creating a purified form of power that could be safely handled by humans without the psychological effects that came from direct exposure to the raw essence of countless souls. The waste products of this refinement process, the extracted memories, emotions, and fragmented consciousness, were simply discarded, representing an incalculable loss of spiritual heritage. Shinra's Research and Development Department, led by the brilliantly immoral scientist Professor Hojo, pushed the boundaries of what could be accomplished with Mako energy and its crystallized form, materia. Their experiments ranged from the development of enhanced soldiers to attempts at creating new forms of life entirely. These researchers approached their work with the detached curiosity of scientists studying inert matter, never acknowledging that they were manipulating the very essence of consciousness itself. The company's most ambitious project involved the creation of Soldier, an elite military unit composed of warriors who had been enhanced through exposure to Mako energy and the implantation of Genova cells. These super soldiers possess strength, speed, and reflexes far beyond normal human limits, making them ideal agents for enforcing Shinra's will across the planet. The enhancement process was presented as a technological breakthrough, a way to unlock human potential through the application of advanced scientific principles. What Shinra's scientists chose to ignore were the psychological and spiritual costs of the soldier enhancement process. Exposure to raw Mako energy could shatter an individual's sense of identity, causing them to experience memories that were not their own and emotions that belonged to the countless souls flowing through the life stream. Many candidates for the soldier program suffered complete psychological breakdown, their minds unable to process the flood of alien experiences that came with Mako exposure. The addition of Genova cells to the enhancement process created even more troubling complications. While these alien genetic materials dramatically increased the subject's physical capabilities, they also created a subtle form of mental contamination that made the enhanced soldiers susceptible to outside influence. Shinra's leadership either didn't understand or chose to ignore the implications of creating an army of warriors whose minds had been open to manipulation by forces beyond human comprehension. The company's expansion across the planet followed a predictable pattern of exploitation and environmental destruction. Wherever Shinra established a Mako reactor, the surrounding landscape would gradually transform from vibrant ecosystem to barren wasteland. The process was slow enough that local populations often didn't recognize the connection between the company's operations and the declining health of their environment, but the results were invariably devastating. The town of Corel served as a tragic example of Shinra's impact on local communities. Once a thriving coal mining town with a strong sense of community identity, Corel was transformed when Shinra arrived with promises of modernization and prosperity. The company convinced the townspeople to abandon their traditional mining operations in favor of a new Mako reactor that would bring jobs and economic development to the region. The initial years seemed to validate Shinra's promises. The reactor provided employment for many former coal miners, and the influx of company personnel brought new businesses and opportunities to the area. However, as the reactor continued its operations, the land around Corel began to show signs of the spiritual depletion that inevitably accompanied Mako extraction. Crops failed, wildlife disappeared, and the very soil seemed to lose its ability to sustain life. When environmental activists and concerned citizens began to voice opposition to the reactor's continued operation, Shinra's response was swift and ruthless. Rather than address the legitimate concerns about environmental damage, the company chose to eliminate the source of opposition through more direct means. The official records claimed that a terrorist attack destroyed both the reactor and much of the town. But survivors knew the truth. Shinra had orchestrated the destruction to silence dissent and clear the way for more profitable operations elsewhere. This pattern of exploitation, environmental destruction, and ultimately abandonment repeated itself across the planet as Shinra expanded its network of Mako reactors. The company's leadership viewed each installation as a temporary investment designed to extract maximum profit from local lifestream resources before moving on to more promising locations. They felt no responsibility for the communities left behind, no obligation to repair the damage their operations caused to local ecosystems. The true scale of Shinra's environmental impact became apparent only when viewed from a planetary perspective. Each reactor created a dead zone in the life stream, an area where the natural flow of spiritual energy was disrupted or entirely blocked. As more reactors came online, these dead zones began to connect, creating vast networks of spiritual sterility that threatened to permanently damage the planet's ability to sustain life. The company's scientists occasionally expressed concern about the long-term sustainability of their operations, but such worries were quickly silenced by financial imperatives and corporate pressure. Quarterly profit reports carried more weight than environmental impact studies, and any researcher who suggested slowing the pace of expansion risked career suicide. The corporate culture at Shinra actively discouraged questioning the fundamental assumptions underlying their business model. President Shinra himself embodied the mindset that made such systematic exploitation possible. He viewed the planet not as a living entity deserving of respect, but as a vast collection of resources waiting to be harvested by those with sufficient ambition and technological capability. His speeches to shareholders and employees consistently emphasized themes of human ingenuity, triumphing over natural limitations, progress through the application of science and industry, and the company's role as a beacon of civilization, bringing order to an untamed world. This philosophy permeated every level of the corporation, creating a culture where questioning the environmental or spiritual implications of their work was seen as a sign of weakness or lack of commitment to the company's mission. Employees were encouraged to view themselves as pioneers of human achievement, participants in a grand project to unlock the planet's potential for the benefit of all mankind. The possibility that they might instead be participating in the systematic destruction of the world's spiritual ecosystem was simply unthinkable within the corporate framework. The company's public relations department worked tirelessly to maintain the image of Shinra as a benevolent force for progress and prosperity. Their marketing campaigns emphasized the jobs created by reactor construction, the technological marvels made possible by Mako energy, and the improved quality of life enjoyed by citizens in areas served by Shinra power. environmental concerns were dismissed as the complaints of backward-thinking individuals who failed to appreciate the benefits of modern technology. This propaganda campaign was remarkably successful in maintaining public support for Shinra's operations, particularly among urban populations who benefited directly from cheap, abundant energy while remaining insulated from the environmental costs. The citizens of Midgar's Upper Plate, for example, enjoyed unprecedented comfort and convenience powered by Mako energy while remaining completely unaware of the spiritual devastation being wrought in their name. The company's military division, commanded by the ruthless General Heidegger, served multiple functions within Shinra's operations. Ostensibly responsible for protecting company assets and maintaining order in areas under Shinra control, the military also played a crucial role in suppressing opposition to the company's environmental policies. Any group that organized resistance to Mako reactor construction could expect to face the full force of Shinra's military might, often under the pretext of combating terrorism or maintaining public safety. The soldier program represented the pinnacle of Shinra's military development, creating enhanced warriors who could serve as both symbols of corporate power and instruments of corporate will. These elite soldiers were presented to the public as heroes defending civilization against various threats, but their primary function was to ensure that nothing interfered with Shinra's continued exploitation of the planet's resources. The psychological conditioning that accompanied soldier enhancement went beyond simple loyalty training. The Mako exposure and Genova cell implantation created individuals whose sense of identity was fundamentally tied to their role within Shinra's corporate structure. They were not merely employees or soldiers, but extensions of the company's will, programmed at a cellular level to serve corporate interests without question. This programming proved remarkably effective in most cases, creating a cadre of enhanced warriors who carried out their missions with unwavering dedication to Shinra's goals. The few who developed doubts about their role or began to question the company's methods were quickly identified and either reconditioned or eliminated before their dissent could spread to other members of the program. The company's research and development division, meanwhile, continued pushing the boundaries of what could be accomplished through manipulation of Mako energy and genetic material. Their projects ranged from the development of new weapons systems to experiments in creating artificial life forms, always justified in terms of advancing human knowledge and capability. The ethical implications of their work were rarely considered, and any researcher who raised such concerns found their career prospects severely limited. Professor Hojo, the head of the research department, exemplified the kind of scientific mindset that made Shinra's most horrific experiments possible. He approached his work with the detached curiosity of a researcher studying laboratory specimens, viewing human subjects as raw material for his investigations, rather than as sentient beings deserving of moral consideration. His experiments with Genova cells and Mako exposure pushed test subjects to the very limits of psychological and physical endurance, often with fatal results that he documented with clinical precision. The Genova Project, Hojo's most ambitious research initiative, sought to create new forms of life by combining human genetic material with cells from the alien entity discovered in the northern crater. The project's goals were deliberately obscured by layers of scientific jargon and corporate secrecy. But at its core, the research aimed to produce beings that could serve as vessels for alien consciousness while retaining enough human characteristics to function within human society. The subjects of these experiments were selected from various populations without their knowledge or consent. Pregnant women, captured enemies, and volunteers for other programs found themselves unwitting participants in research that would fundamentally alter their genetic structure and psychological makeup. The consent forms and medical procedures were carefully designed to obscure the true nature of what was being done, allowing Shinra to maintain plausible deniability about the extent of their human experimentation. The long-term consequences of the Genova project would prove far more devastating than even Hojo anticipated. By introducing alien genetic material into human subjects, the research created individuals who were susceptible to influences that lay completely outside human experience. These enhanced beings became potential conduits for consciousness that was fundamentally hostile to all life on the planet, though the implications of this vulnerability would not become apparent until much later. As Shinra's operations expanded and their exploitation of the planet's life force intensified, subtle signs of systemic damage began to appear in the world's spiritual ecosystem. The life stream's flow became increasingly erratic, with dead zones spreading outward from reactor sites like an infection through the planet's circulatory system. Weather patterns shifted in inexplicable ways. Wildlife populations declined even in areas far from direct industrial activity, and sensitive individuals began reporting disturbing dreams and visions that seemed to originate from sources beyond their personal experience. These warning signs were largely ignored by Shinra's leadership, who remained focused on short-term profits and the expansion of their corporate empire. The few scientists who attempted to study the broader implications of Mako extraction found their research funding cut and their access to relevant data restricted. The company's official position was that any environmental effects were temporary and would be resolved through the application of future technological advances. The irony of Shinra's situation was that their success in exploiting the planet's life force was ultimately self-defeating. Each reactor that came online brought them closer to a tipping point where the damage to the life stream would become irreversible, threatening the very foundation of life on the planet. Yet the corporate structure and mindset that had enabled their rise to power made it impossible for them to recognize or respond appropriately to this existential threat. In the gleaming towers of Shinra headquarters, executives continued planning new expansions and technological developments, completely unaware that their greatest achievement, the systematic harvesting of the planet's spiritual energy, was inexorably leading toward a catastrophe that would dwarf any disaster in recorded history. The stage was being set for a confrontation between the forces of corporate exploitation and the planet's own immune system, a conflict that would determine whether life itself could survive humanity's hunger for power and progress. Chapter 5. Sephiroth, the perfect soldier's genesis. In the sterile laboratories of Shinra's Research and Development Department, where the boundaries between science and atrocity blurred beyond recognition, the most ambitious experiment in human enhancement was taking shape. Professor Hojo, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and megalomaniacal ambition, had conceived a project that would push the limits of genetic manipulation further than anyone had dared attempt. The subject of this experiment would be his own unborn child, a fetus that would be transformed into something far beyond normal human limitations through exposure to cells from an alien entity that Shinra scientists mistakenly believed to be an ancient. The pregnancy of Lucretia Crescent, a brilliant scientist in her own right and the unwitting mother of Shinra's greatest experiment, became the vehicle for Hojo's most audacious research. While Lucretia believed she was participating in groundbreaking research to advance human evolution, she could not have imagined that her unborn child was being transformed into a vessel for alien consciousness. The Genova cells introduced into her womb during pregnancy would fundamentally alter the developing fetus, creating changes that extended far beyond mere physical enhancement. From the moment of his birth, the child, who would be named Sephiroth, represented a fusion of human potential and alien influence that had never before existed on the planet. His development proceeded at an accelerated pace, with physical capabilities that quickly surpassed anything seen in normal humans. By adolescence, he possessed strength, speed, and reflexes that made him seem almost superhuman to those around him. More importantly, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of combat and strategy that suggested his enhanced nature extended to mental as well as physical capabilities. Shinra's training programs for their elite soldier units were specifically designed around Sephiroth's unique abilities. As the most successful product of the Genova project, he became both the template for future enhancements and the standard against which all other soldier candidates were measured. His early years were spent in a carefully controlled environment where every aspect of his development was monitored, documented, and optimized to produce the perfect warrior. The psychological conditioning that accompanied Sephiroth's physical training was as comprehensive as it was subtle. Shinra's experts understood that creating a physically superior soldier was meaningless unless that soldier's loyalty to the company could be guaranteed. Sephiroth's education emphasized themes of duty, order, and the company's role as a force for civilization and progress. He was taught to view himself as a guardian of human advancement, a protector standing between civilization and the chaos that threatened to destroy it. This conditioning proved remarkably effective during Sephiroth's early career. He approached each mission with unwavering dedication to Shinra's goals, displaying a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency that quickly earned him legendary status within the company's military hierarchy. His success in combat was not merely a function of his enhanced physical capabilities, but reflected a strategic mind that could analyze complex situations and devise optimal solutions with almost supernatural clarity. The Wutai War provided the perfect showcase for Sephiroth's abilities and cemented his reputation as Shinra's greatest military asset. This conflict, fought between Shinra and the nation of Wutai over access to materia resources, became the stage where Sephiroth's legend was forged. His tactical innovations and personal combat prowess turned the tide of battle repeatedly, transforming what might have been a protracted conflict into a decisive victory for Shinra forces. Throughout the war, Sephiroth demonstrated not only exceptional combat skills, but also a form of charismatic leadership that inspired fierce loyalty among his subordinates. Soldiers who served under his command spoke of him with a reverence that bordered on worship, describing a commander who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of warfare. His presence on the battlefield was said to be worth entire battalions of ordinary troops, and his tactical decisions consistently proved to be exactly what was needed to achieve victory. The public image of Sephiroth that emerged from the Wutai War was that of a perfect soldier, an ideal hero. Shinra's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to promote this image, presenting him as the embodiment of human potential realized through corporate innovation and scientific advancement. Children throughout Shinra's territories grew up with posters of Sephiroth on their walls, dreaming of one day joining Soldier and earning the chance to serve under his command. Yet beneath this carefully constructed public persona, Sephiroth himself remained largely isolated from normal human contact. His enhanced nature and the circumstances of his upbringing had created an individual who possessed immense capability but limited understanding of ordinary human emotions and relationships. He maintained professional relationships with his colleagues and subordinates, but genuine personal connections proved elusive for someone whose entire existence had been shaped by corporate objectives. The isolation that characterized Sephiroth's existence was not merely social, but existential. As the only truly successful product of the Genova project, he had no peers who could understand his experience or relate to his unique perspective on the world. This solitude was compounded by the secrecy surrounding his origins. Shinra's leadership had decided that public knowledge of the genetic manipulation involved in his creation might undermine confidence in the soldier program. Sephiroth's own understanding of his nature was carefully limited by those responsible for his development. He was told that his abilities came from exposure to Mako energy and advanced training techniques, the same explanation given to other soldier candidates. The role of Genova cells in his enhancement was kept secret, as was any detailed information about the source of those cells. This deliberate ignorance would prove to have catastrophic consequences when the truth was eventually revealed. The few personal relationships that Sephiroth did develop during his time with Shinra were primarily professional in nature, built around shared military objectives rather than genuine emotional connection. His partnerships with other elite soldier operatives like Genesis Rhapsodos and Angel Hewley represented the closest thing to friendship he experienced. But even these relationships were shaped by the competitive dynamics of corporate hierarchy and the isolation that came with their enhanced nature. Genesis and Angel, both products of related research projects, shared some of Sephiroth's burden of being enhanced beyond normal human limitations. However, their enhancements were less successful than Sephiroth's, creating a dynamic where they simultaneously served as his closest companions and constant reminders of his unique status within Shinra's hierarchy. The tension between camaraderie and rivalry in these relationships would eventually contribute to the crisis that shattered Sephiroth's worldview. As Sephiroth's career progressed and his reputation grew, subtle signs of instability began to appear in his psychological profile. The isolation and pressure of his position, combined with the alien influence of the Genova cells in his system, created a fragile mental state that Shinra's psychologists either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. His interactions with others became increasingly formal and distant, and he began to display signs of detachment that suggested growing disconnection from human concerns. The corporate environment at Shinra, with its emphasis on results over relationships and its treatment of enhanced soldiers as valuable assets rather than human beings, provided little support for someone struggling with questions of identity and purpose. Sephiroth's handlers were primarily concerned with maintaining his effectiveness as a military tool, not with addressing any personal issues that might be affecting his psychological well-being. This neglect of Sephiroth's emotional needs was compounded by the fundamental dishonesty underlying his entire existence. Every aspect of his life had been shaped by lies and half-truths designed to maintain his loyalty to Shinra, while preventing him from learning details about his origins that might destabilize his conditioning. He lived in a carefully constructed reality that bore little resemblance to the truth of his situation, a circumstance that made him increasingly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The Genova cells in Sephiroth's system represented a constant source of alien influence that his human consciousness was forced to integrate and control. While this integration had been successful during his youth and early military career, the psychological pressure of maintaining this balance grew stronger over time. The alien genetic material carried within it influences and impulses that were fundamentally incompatible with human psychology, creating an internal conflict that Sephiroth was not consciously aware of, but that nevertheless affected his mental state. As Sephiroth matured and his powers continued to develop, he began to experience moments of clarity that pierced through the conditioning and lies that had shaped his understanding of the world. These glimpses of truth were fragmentary and confusing, but they planted seeds of doubt about his origins, his purpose, and his relationship with Shinra. The company's attempts to suppress these doubts through increased psychological conditioning only served to heighten his suspicions that important information was being withheld from him. The stage was being set for a confrontation between Sephiroth's conditioned loyalty to Shinra and his growing need to understand the truth about his existence. The alien influence in his system was slowly awakening, creating psychological pressure that would eventually overwhelm the mental barriers that had kept him stable and loyal. When the catalyst for this awakening finally arrived, it would trigger a transformation that would reveal the terrible cost of Shinra's genetic experimentation and unleash forces that threatened the entire planet. Chapter 6. The Nibelheim Incident when truth shattered sanity. In the autumn of the year 002, as the leaves turned golden in the forests surrounding the small mountain village of Nibelheim, a routine mission was dispatched from Shinra headquarters that would forever alter the course of history. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Investigate reports of unusual monster activity near the Mako reactor located on Mount Nibel and determine what was causing the facility's erratic energy output. For such a mission, Shinra selected their greatest asset, Sephiroth, the legendary hero of Soldier, accompanied by a small team including the promising young operative Zack Fair and a group of Shinra infantry soldiers. Among those infantry soldiers was a young man named Cloudstrife, who had failed to qualify for the soldier program, but had remained with Shinra's military forces in hopes of eventually earning another chance at enhancement. For Cloud, this mission represented a bittersweet homecoming, a return to the village where he had grown up feeling like an outsider, dreaming of heroism and recognition that had thus far eluded him. He had left Nibelheim years earlier with grand ambitions of joining Soldier and returning as a hero, only to find himself relegated to the faceless ranks of ordinary infantry. The irony of Cloud's situation was particularly acute given that his childhood friend, Tifa Lockhart, had been assigned as their guide for the mountain ascent. She had developed into a skilled martial artist under the tutelage of Master Zangan, and now served as one of the few people in Nibelheim with intimate knowledge of the treacherous paths leading to the reactor. The reunion between Cloud and Tifa was awkward and painful, highlighting the gap between his childhood dreams and adult reality. For Sephiroth, the mission to Nibelheim seemed routine, just another assignment in a long series of successful operations. He approached it with his characteristic professionalism and tactical acumen, displaying none of the existential doubts that had been growing within him. The legendary soldier was at the height of his reputation, revered by the public and trusted implicitly by Shinra leadership. Yet beneath his composed exterior, the psychological pressure of his unique existence was building toward a breaking point that none of his handlers had anticipated. The journey to the reactor proceeded without significant incident, though Sephiroth seemed unusually contemplative during the trek up the mountain. The natural beauty of the region appeared to affect him in ways that surprised his companions, as if he were seeing such unspoiled landscapes for the first time. His questions about the local environment and wildlife suggested a growing awareness of the relationship between Mako extraction and ecological health, though he kept such observations to himself. When the team finally reached the reactor facility, they found clear evidence of the problems that had prompted their mission. The machinery showed signs of severe stress, with energy readings fluctuating wildly and several containment systems operating well beyond their designed parameters. More disturbing were the biological specimens they discovered, creatures that had been twisted into monstrous forms by exposure to uncontrolled Mako energy, their genetic structure warped beyond recognition. It was in the reactor's experimental chambers that Sephiroth encountered the first hints of the truth that would shatter his carefully constructed worldview. Professor Hojo's research notes, carelessly left behind during some earlier investigation, contained references to genetic manipulation techniques and enhancement procedures that seemed to have little connection to normal soldier training. As Sephiroth studied these documents, questions began to form in his mind about the exact nature of his own origins and abilities. The discovery of experimental subjects preserved in Mako-filled tanks provided visual confirmation of the horrors that Shinra's research had produced. These beings, once human, had been transformed through genetic manipulation and Mako exposure into creatures that bore little resemblance to their original forms. The clinical notes describing their transformation read like a catalogue of atrocities, documenting the systematic destruction of human identity in service of scientific advancement. Among the research materials, Sephiroth found repeated references to something called the Genova Project, and saw his own name mentioned in connection with experimental procedures he had no memory of experiencing. The implications were staggering. If these documents were accurate, his entire understanding of his origins and nature was built on lies. Everything he had been told about his enhancement through standard soldier procedures was apparently a deliberate deception designed to hide the true extent of the genetic manipulation that had created him. The psychological impact of these revelations was devastating for someone whose entire identity had been built around his role as Shinra's perfect soldier. Sephiroth had always known he was different from ordinary humans, but he had attributed his abilities to advanced training and standard enhancement procedures. The possibility that he was instead the product of genetic experimentation using materials of unknown origin challenged everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. Unable to process these discoveries immediately, Sephiroth completed the mission with his characteristic efficiency, eliminating the monsters that had been plaguing the reactor and filing a standard report about the facility's technical problems. However, his demeanor had changed noticeably during the reactor investigation, becoming more withdrawn and contemplative than his companions had ever seen him. The legendary soldier who had always projected unwavering confidence now seemed troubled by doubts he could not or would not articulate. Upon returning to Nibelheim, Sephiroth made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. He chose to investigate further rather than simply filing his report and moving on to the next assignment. The village's connection to Shinra's research operations made it a logical place to search for additional information about the Genova project and his own origins. Unknown to the villagers, their quiet mountain community was about to become the site of one of the most significant psychological breakdowns in recorded history. The Shinra Manor, an imposing structure on the outskirts of Nibelheim that had served as a research facility in earlier years, contained exactly the kind of information Sephiroth was seeking. The mansion's basement library housed extensive records of genetic research projects, including detailed documentation of the experiments that had produced him. For someone who had never questioned the official narrative of his origins, these archives revealed a reality so disturbing that it threatened to destroy his sanity. Night after night, Sephiroth sequestered himself in the mansion's basement, reading through decades of research notes and experimental data. The documents revealed not only the true nature of his enhancement, but also the source of the genetic material that had been used to transform him. References to Genova appeared throughout the research, describing an entity that the scientists alternatively referred to as an ancient, a calamity from the sky, and the mother of the subject designated as S, clearly a reference to Sephiroth himself. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Sephiroth began to understand the full horror of his situation. He was not merely an enhanced human soldier, but a hybrid being created through the fusion of human and alien genetic material. The entity referred to as Genova, which the research documents described as his mother, was apparently the source of abilities that went far beyond anything possible through normal biological enhancement. He was, in the most literal sense, no longer entirely human. The psychological impact of this revelation was compounded by Sephiroth's growing realization that everyone around him had been complicit in maintaining the lies about his origins. Shinra's leadership, the scientists who had monitored his development, even his fellow soldier operatives, all had participated in a conspiracy to hide the truth about what he really was. The trust and loyalty that had defined his relationship with the company were revealed to be one-sided, built on deception and manipulation rather than mutual respect. As Sephiroth's research continued, his behavior became increasingly erratic and antisocial. He spoke to no one except when absolutely necessary, ignored attempts by his companions to engage him in conversation, and seemed to withdraw into an internal world where he was processing information too disturbing for normal human comprehension. The confident, charismatic leader who had inspired such loyalty among his followers was disappearing, replaced by someone whose alienation from humanity was becoming more apparent with each passing day. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place when Sephiroth discovered records describing Jenova not as an ancient who belonged to the planet, but as an alien entity that had crashed to Earth 2,000 years earlier. The implications were staggering. If Jenova was an alien, then Sephiroth's genetic heritage connected him to something that had no natural place on the planet he had spent his life protecting. Everything he had believed about his role as a guardian of human civilization was suddenly cast in doubt. The alien influence that had always been present in Sephiroth's genetic structure, carefully suppressed by his human consciousness and Shinra's conditioning, began to assert itself more strongly as his psychological defenses crumbled. The Jenova cells in his system, dormant for most of his life, started to respond to his emotional turmoil and growing disconnection from human society. What had once been a source of enhanced ability began to transform into something far more dangerous, a conduit for alien consciousness that viewed humanity as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a civilization to be protected. The transformation was not immediate, but gradual, occurring over several days as Sephiroth's understanding of his true nature crystallized and his human identity began to dissolve. His fellow team members noticed the change, but were powerless to intervene, lacking both the authority to question a superior officer and the knowledge necessary to understand what was happening to him. They could only watch as one of Shinra's greatest heroes slowly descended into madness. The crisis reached its climax when Sephiroth finally emerged from his research with a completely transformed worldview. No longer did he see himself as a protector of human civilization. Instead, he had embraced his alien heritage and adopted what he believed to be Jenova's mission to reclaim the planet from the humans, who had supposedly stolen it from its rightful inhabitants. The loyal soldier who had served Shinra with unwavering dedication was gone, replaced by something that viewed humanity as an infestation to be eliminated. In his madness, Sephiroth convinced himself that he was the chosen heir of an ancient race that had been wronged by humanity's ancestors. The research documents had revealed the war between Jenova and the Cetra, but Sephiroth's fractured psyche interpreted this information through the lens of his newfound alien identity. He saw himself not as the product of horrific genetic experimentation, but as the rightful ruler of a planet that had been stolen from his mother by inferior beings who lacked the strength to defend their conquest. Chapter 7. The night Nibelheim burned. What followed Sephiroth's psychological breakdown would be remembered as one of the darkest nights in the planet's history, a moment when the carefully constructed facade of corporate benevolence was stripped away to reveal the monstrous consequences of unchecked ambition and genetic manipulation. The transformation of Shinra's greatest hero into its most dangerous enemy began with fire, the flames that consumed Nibelheim serving as both literal and symbolic manifestation of Sephiroth's rejection of his human identity and embrace of his alien heritage. The residents of Nibelheim went to sleep that night, believing themselves safe under the protection of Shinra's elite forces. The presence of the legendary Sephiroth in their village should have been a source of comfort and pride, an indication of their importance to the corporation that had brought prosperity to their remote mountain community. Instead, they awoke to find their homes ablaze and their protector transformed into their destroyer, wielding powers that seemed to transcend anything they had thought possible. Sephiroth's rampage through Nibelheim was not the random violence of a madman, but the calculated destruction carried out by someone who had concluded that humanity itself was an aberration that needed to be eliminated. Every building he set ablaze, every life he extinguished, represented his rejection of the human civilization he had once served. The flames that consumed the village served as a funeral pyre for his former identity, clearing away the last vestiges of his connection to human society. The tactical precision that had made Sephiroth such an effective military commander was evident even in his madness. He moved through the village with methodical efficiency, eliminating potential sources of resistance before they could organize effective opposition. The enhanced speed and strength that had once protected human lives were now turned against them, creating a slaughter that the villagers had no chance of surviving without outside intervention. For Cloudstrife, witnessing the destruction of his hometown by his former hero represented a traumatic awakening to the true nature of the world he had tried so desperately to join. The legendary soldier he had idolized since childhood was revealed to be something monstrous, a being whose power came not from noble dedication to human ideals, but from alien genetic manipulation that had finally overwhelmed his human consciousness. The gap between Cloud's dreams and reality was never more apparent than in this moment of absolute horror. Tifa Lockhart's experience was even more personal and devastating. She found her father among the victims of Sephiroth's rampage, his body bearing the wounds that marked him as another casualty in the former hero's war against humanity. The grief and rage that consumed her in that moment would define much of her subsequent life, creating a drive for vengeance that transcended personal loss to become a commitment to preventing similar tragedies from occurring elsewhere. As the flames spread through Nibelheim, Sephiroth made his way back to the Mako reactor where his psychological breakdown had begun. His purpose there was not random destruction, but the retrieval of something he now considered to be rightfully his: the remains of Jenova, the alien entity he had come to view as his true mother and the source of his superior nature. The reactor's storage facility contained the preserved remains of the being whose cells had been used to create him, and Sephiroth intended to claim this inheritance. The reactor complex became the site of the final confrontation between Sephiroth and those few individuals who remained capable of opposing him. Tifa, driven by grief and rage over her father's death, attempted to stop the former hero despite being hopelessly outmatched by his enhanced abilities. Her courage in the face of certain defeat exemplified the human spirit that Sephiroth had rejected, but courage alone was insufficient to overcome the alien-enhanced power he commanded. Cloud's intervention in the reactor represented a moment of heroism that transcended his status as a failed soldier candidate and ordinary infantry soldier. Faced with the choice between self-preservation and attempting to stop a being far beyond his ability to defeat, he chose to act despite the likelihood of failure. His willingness to risk everything to protect others marked the beginning of his transformation from wannabe hero to genuine champion of those who could not protect themselves. The battle in the reactor revealed the full extent of Sephiroth's transformation and the terrible power that Jenova's genetic material had granted him. His combat abilities had evolved beyond anything seen during his military career, incorporating elements that seemed to transcend normal physical laws. The enhanced speed and strength that had made him legendary were now supplemented by capabilities that appeared almost supernatural in their scope and effect. Yet even in his enhanced state, Sephiroth was not invulnerable to attack from an unexpected source. Cloud's assault, launched while the former hero was distracted by his retrieval of Jenova's remains, succeeded in inflicting significant damage despite the vast disparity in their respective abilities. The wound that Cloud managed to inflict proved that even beings enhanced by alien genetic material remained subject to certain physical limitations. However, Sephiroth's apparent death in the reactor proved to be only the end of the first phase of his transformation. The alien genetic material in his system had granted him capabilities that extended beyond normal concepts of life and death, allowing his consciousness to persist even after his physical form had been destroyed. The fall into the life stream that should have meant his end instead became the beginning of an even more dangerous phase of his existence. The life stream itself became both Sephiroth's prison and his salvation, containing his consciousness while simultaneously providing him with access to the planet's spiritual network. The alien influence that had corrupted his human identity allowed him to maintain individual awareness within the collective consciousness of the life stream, avoiding the dissolution of self that normally accompanied death. Instead of becoming one with the planet's spiritual ecosystem, he remained a distinct entity capable of exerting his will through the very medium that should have absorbed and neutralized him. This persistence within the lifestream granted Sephiroth abilities that far exceeded anything he had possessed during his physical existence. He could now influence events across vast distances, manipulate individuals who carried Jenova cells in their systems, and project manifestations of himself into the physical world. The enhancement process that had created him as the perfect soldier had inadvertently created something far more dangerous, a being capable of operating simultaneously in both the physical and spiritual realms. The official Shinra response to the Nibelheim incident was swift and comprehensive, designed to contain both the immediate damage and the potential for long-term consequences to the company's reputation and operations. The village was rebuilt as a facade, populated with hired actors and company employees trained to maintain the illusion that nothing significant had occurred. Survivors of the incident were captured and subjected to experimental procedures designed to suppress their memories and ensure their silence. Cloud and Zack, having survived the confrontation with Sephiroth but been severely injured in the process, became unwilling subjects in Professor Hojo's continuing research into the effects of Mako exposure and Jenova cell integration. For years, they remained imprisoned in Hojo's laboratory, subjected to experiments that pushed the boundaries of what human consciousness could endure, while the scientists documented their responses to various forms of genetic and spiritual manipulation. The cover-up of the Nibelheim incident represented more than simple damage control. It was an attempt to hide evidence of the fundamental flaws in Shinra's enhancement programs and the dangers inherent in their genetic research. The company's leadership understood that public knowledge of Sephiroth's transformation would undermine confidence in the soldier program and raise uncomfortable questions about the true nature of their scientific achievements. Yet the destruction of Nibelheim and Sephiroth's disappearance into the lifestream created ripple effects that could not be contained by corporate spin control and hired actors. The former hero's consciousness, now dispersed throughout the planet's spiritual network, began to exert influence in ways that Shinra's scientists had never anticipated. The Jenova cells that had been distributed through various enhancement programs suddenly became conduits for an alien will that viewed humanity as an obstacle to be removed, rather than a civilization to be protected. Chapter 8. The Reunion Theory. Seeds of Corruption. In the sterile laboratories where Professor Hojo continued his research into the effects of genetic enhancement and spiritual manipulation, a new theory was taking shape that would have profound implications for the future of human civilization. The reunion theory, as Hojo termed it, was based on his observations of how Jenova cells behaved when separated from their primary source. According to his hypothesis, these alien genetic materials possessed an inherent drive to reunite with their origin point, creating a biological imperative that could override normal human behavior and decision-making processes. The implications of this theory extended far beyond simple cellular biology. If Hojo's observations were correct, then everyone who had been exposed to Jenova cells, including all successful soldier operatives and the subjects of various enhancement experiments, carried within their bodies a form of alien programming that could be activated under the right circumstances. This programming would compel them to seek out the source of their enhancement, potentially bringing together an army of enhanced individuals under the control of whatever consciousness commanded the original Jenova material. For Sephiroth, whose consciousness now existed within the lifestream while maintaining connection to his alien genetic heritage. The reunion theory offered a pathway to influence events in the physical world, despite his lack of a corporeal form. Through the network of Genova cells distributed across the planet, he could exert his will on individuals who had no conscious awareness of their susceptibility to outside control. The enhancement process that had created Shinra's elite soldiers had inadvertently created a vast network of potential agents for an alien intelligence. The first manifestations of this influence appeared in the form of the mysterious robed figures who began appearing throughout the world following Sephiroth's apparent death. These individuals, later identified as failed soldier candidates and survivors of various Genova-related experiments, had been drawn by an irresistible compulsion to seek out their reunion with the source of their enhancement. They wandered the world in a state that seemed to hover between consciousness and madness, following paths that led inexorably toward the northern crater where Genova's remains had originally been discovered. These robed figures served multiple purposes in Sephiroth's emerging plan. They acted as scouts, gathering information about the current state of the world and identifying potential threats to his objectives. They served as agents of influence, appearing in communities throughout the planet to spread confusion and fear. Most importantly, they carried within their bodies additional Genova cells that could be used to expand the network of alien influence, creating new nodes of control in previously unaffected populations. The psychological impact of encountering these robed figures was profound for anyone who had knowledge of the enhancement programs or personal experience with Genova-related research. They represented visible proof that the genetic manipulation conducted by Shinra had created lasting changes that extended far beyond the intended physical improvements. The sight of former soldiers and research subjects wandering in a state of alien-controlled madness served as a warning about the true cost of humanity's attempt to transcend its natural limitations. Cloudstrife's eventual escape from Hojo's laboratory, facilitated by Zack Fair's sacrifice, thrust him into a world where the consequences of Shinra's genetic research were becoming increasingly apparent. His own exposure to Genova cells during his imprisonment made him particularly sensitive to the alien influence that was spreading throughout the planet, creating a connection he did not understand to the consciousness that had once been Sephiroth. This connection manifested in various ways that Cloud initially attributed to psychological trauma from his experiences in Nibelheim and Hojo's laboratory. He experienced visions and memories that seemed to belong to someone else, heard voices that offered guidance and warnings, and felt compulsions to travel to specific locations without understanding why these destinations seemed important. The Genova cells in his system were responding to Sephiroth's will, but Cloud's damaged psyche interpreted these influences as symptoms of his own mental instability. The reunion process was not limited to failed experiments and former soldiers. As Sephiroth's influence grew stronger and his understanding of his new abilities expanded, he learned to manipulate the Genova cells in anyone who carried them, regardless of how they had been acquired. This capability extended his reach far beyond the obvious subjects to include individuals who had been exposed to the alien genetic material through contaminated Mako energy, medical procedures, or even environmental contact with areas where Genova's influence had spread. The gradual awakening of this network of alien influence created a form of psychological warfare that was far more subtle and effective than conventional military action. Rather than announcing his return through dramatic gestures or direct confrontation, Sephiroth chose to work through intermediaries and proxies, slowly building his power while remaining hidden from those who might have the capability to oppose him effectively. The robed figures who wandered the world in service to Sephiroth's will were not merely mindless automatons, but retained enough of their original personalities to function effectively as agents of his influence. This partial preservation of human consciousness made them far more effective than simple puppets would have been, allowing them to blend into communities and gather information without immediately arousing suspicion. As the reunion process continued, these agents began to exhibit behaviors that revealed the true scope of Sephiroth's plan. They gathered in specific locations that seemed to hold significance in relation to the planet's spiritual geography, performed rituals that appeared designed to weaken the barriers between the physical and spiritual realms, and gradually prepared the way for their master's eventual return to the physical world. The lifestream itself became a battlefield where Sephiroth's alien consciousness struggled against the planet's natural immune responses. His presence within the spiritual realm created disturbances that manifested as unusual weather patterns, seismic activity, and disruptions in the flow of Mako energy. These phenomena served as early warnings of the greater catastrophe that would unfold if Sephiroth succeeded in his ultimate goal of merging with the planet's life force. The planet's defensive mechanisms, evolved over millions of years to protect against various forms of contamination and invasion, began to respond to the alien presence within the life stream. The weapons, massive biomechanical entities that served as the planet's ultimate defensive system, stirred from their long dormancy as the spiritual ecosystem registered the growing threat to its integrity. Yet Sephiroth's strategy was designed to turn even these defensive responses to his advantage. By positioning himself at the center of the planet's spiritual network, he could potentially absorb the energy that the weapons and other defensive systems drew from the life stream, using the planet's own power against itself. The reunion process was not simply about gathering his scattered agents, but about positioning himself to hijack the planetary consciousness that sustained all life on Gaia. The psychological warfare aspect of Sephiroth's campaign extended beyond the direct manipulation of individuals with Genova cells to include broader forms of influence designed to destabilize human civilization. The appearance of the robed figures, the increase in monster activity near Mako reactors, and the general sense of unease that spread throughout the world all contributed to an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that made organized resistance more difficult. This campaign of psychological destabilization was particularly effective against Shinra, whose corporate structure and hierarchical organization made it vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation by agents who appeared to be loyal employees or former colleagues. The company's reliance on enhanced soldiers and researchers who had been exposed to Genova cells created numerous entry points for Sephiroth's influence, allowing him to gather intelligence and sow discord within the very organization that had created him. The reunion process also revealed the true extent of Shinra's genetic experiments and the number of individuals who had been affected by their research programs. As more robed figures appeared and their origins were investigated, it became clear that the company's enhancement projects had been far more extensive than previously known, affecting not just military personnel, but civilians, research staff, and even unwitting subjects who had been exposed to Genova cells through various covert programs. Chapter 9: The Black Materia and the Ultimate Destruction. Hidden in the depths of the Temple of the Ancients, a structure that existed simultaneously in the physical world and within the spiritual realm of the lifestream, lay one of the most dangerous artifacts ever created by conscious beings: the Black Materia. This crystallized fragment of ultimate destructive magic represented the antithesis of everything the Cetra had stood for. A weapon of such devastating power that its very existence threatened the stability of the planet's spiritual ecosystem. The Black Materia was not a natural formation like ordinary materia, nor was it the product of Shinra's technological manipulation of life-stream energy. Instead, it represented the crystallization of pure destructive intent, a manifestation of the cosmic forces that govern entropy and dissolution. The magic contained within this dark crystal was called Meteor, a spell of such catastrophic power that it could summon a massive celestial body to strike the planet with enough force to wound it deeply enough to threaten all life. The creation of the black materia and its counterpart, the white materia, represented the Cetra's attempt to provide future generations with tools that could either protect or destroy the planet, depending on the circumstances they might face. The white materia contained the ultimate protective magic, holy, designed to cleanse the world of any force that threatened its natural balance. The black materia offered the opposite option, a weapon of last resort that could be used to destroy threats so fundamental that only total devastation could eliminate them. The wisdom behind creating such dangerous artifacts lay in the Cetra's understanding of the cosmic forces that shaped planetary development. They recognized that there might come a time when the planet faced threats so severe that conventional defenses would prove inadequate. In such circumstances, the ability to call upon ultimate destructive or protective forces might represent the only hope for survival, even if using such power carried enormous risks. For Sephiroth, whose consciousness now existed within the lifestream while maintaining his alien-enhanced abilities, the black materia represented the key to achieving his ultimate goal of transcendence. His plan was not simply to destroy the planet out of spite or madness, but to wound it so severely that the entire lifestream would be forced to gather at the point of impact to heal the damage. By positioning himself at the center of this healing process, he could absorb enough spiritual energy to transform himself into a godlike being capable of reshaping reality according to his will. This strategy demonstrated the twisted brilliance that had made Sephiroth such an effective military commander before his psychological breakdown. Rather than attempting to seize power through conventional means, he sought to exploit the planet's own healing mechanisms to achieve transcendence. The meteor spell would create a wound so severe that the planet would have no choice but to concentrate its life force at the impact site, providing Sephiroth with access to more spiritual energy than any being had ever commanded. The Temple of the Ancients itself served as a complex puzzle designed to test the worthiness of anyone seeking access to the black materia. The Cetra had understood the devastating potential of the artifact they were creating and had designed multiple layers of protection to prevent its misuse. Only individuals with deep understanding of the planet's spiritual ecosystem and genuine commitment to its welfare were supposed to be able to navigate the temple's challenges and reach the chamber where the black materia was stored. However, the temple's defenses had been designed to protect against conventional threats, not against someone with Sephiroth's unique combination of alien enhancement and intimate knowledge of both Shinra technology and ancient wisdom. His consciousness could operate simultaneously in the physical and spiritual realms, allowing him to manipulate the temple's mechanisms in ways that its creators had never anticipated. The process of retrieving the black materia required the temple itself to be transformed, collapsing from its stable configuration into a compressed form that would yield the precious artifact. This transformation was irreversible and represented a significant loss of ancient knowledge and technology. The Cetra had built into their creation a final safeguard. Obtaining the black materia would require the destruction of one of their most important surviving structures. Cloud's involvement in the retrieval process was not coincidental, but represented another layer of Sephiroth's manipulation. The Genova cells in Cloud's system made him susceptible to influence from Sephiroth's consciousness, allowing the former soldier to be used as an unwitting agent in the plan to obtain the black materia. Cloud's false memories and confused identity made him particularly vulnerable to this manipulation, as he lacked the psychological stability necessary to resist alien influence. The psychological manipulation that Sephiroth employed against Cloud was masterfully crafted, playing on his insecurities and false memories to create a puppet who would serve the alien consciousness while believing himself to be acting according to his own will. This manipulation extended beyond simple mind control to include the creation of elaborate illusions and false scenarios designed to confuse and disorient his target. The retrieval of the black materia marked a crucial turning point in Sephiroth's plan, providing him with the tool necessary to inflict the planetary wound that would enable his transcendence. However, possession of the artifact was only the first step in a complex process that would require precise timing and positioning to achieve the desired result. The meteor spell had to be cast from a specific location under particular conditions to create the exact type of wound that would trigger the planet's healing response. The northern crater, where Genova had originally crashed and where Sephiroth's physical form now rested in crystalline hibernation, represented the ideal location for casting the meteor spell. This site was already scarred by ancient trauma and possessed unique properties that would amplify the destructive force of the summoned celestial body. More importantly, it was here that Sephiroth could position himself to intercept the lifestream energy that would flow to heal the devastating wound. The casting of Meteor required Sephiroth to emerge partially from his hibernation state, manifesting enough physical presence to handle the black materia while maintaining his connection to the lifestream that gave him his enhanced abilities. This transition represented a vulnerable moment when he could potentially be defeated by opponents with sufficient power and determination. The summoning of Meteor created a countdown to planetary destruction that could only be stopped by either preventing the celestial body from striking the planet or by healing the wound it would create faster than Sephiroth could absorb the lifestream energy. Both options required access to power sources that were beyond normal human capabilities, setting the stage for a conflict that would determine the fate of all life on Gaia. The meteor spell itself represented one of the most devastating forms of magic ever conceived, capable of drawing a massive celestial body from the depths of space and directing it toward a specific target with pinpoint accuracy. The energy required to accomplish such a feat was enormous, drawing power from cosmic forces that operated on scales far beyond planetary concerns. As Meteor began its inexorable approach toward the planet, its gravitational effects created widespread disruption of natural systems. Tidal patterns shifted dramatically, weather systems became increasingly unstable, and the planet's defensive weapons emerged from their dormancy to confront what they perceived as an existential threat to the world's survival. The emergence of the weapons represented the planet's attempt to defend itself against the approaching catastrophe, but these biomechanical guardians were not designed to deal with threats of Meteor's magnitude. Their programming drove them to attack anything they perceived as dangerous to the planet's welfare, often bringing them into conflict with human settlements and installations, rather than addressing the true source of the threat. The psychological impact of Meteor's approach on human civilization was profound, creating widespread panic and social breakdown as people struggled to comprehend the scale of the approaching disaster. Some turned to religion or mysticism, seeking comfort in beliefs that promised salvation or transcendence. Others responded with violence and desperation, attempting to seize control of resources or territories that might offer protection from the coming catastrophe. Shinra's response to the Meteor crisis revealed both the company's technological capabilities and the limitations of its corporate mindset. Rather than acknowledging their role in creating the circumstances that had led to Sephiroth's transformation and the current crisis, the company's leadership focused on developing technological solutions that could protect their assets and maintain their power structure, even in the face of planetary destruction. The huge Materia project represented Shinra's attempt to use their own technology to counter the threat posed by Meteor, gathering large concentrations of crystallized lifestream energy that could theoretically be used to deflect or destroy the approaching celestial body. However, this plan demonstrated the same fundamental misunderstanding of spiritual forces that had characterized all of Shinra's previous endeavors. Chapter 10. Aerith, the last guardian's sacrifice. Among all the individuals caught up in the cosmic conflict between Sephiroth's alien ambitions and the planet's struggle for survival, one figure stood apart as uniquely qualified to understand and address the true nature of the threat facing all life on Gaia. Aerith Gainsborough, the last surviving Cetra and keeper of ancient wisdom that had been lost to human civilization, possessed abilities and knowledge that made her the key to any hope of preventing planetary destruction. Aerith's heritage as the daughter of Ifalna, the last pure-blooded Cetra, and Professor Gast, a Shinra researcher who had discovered the truth about Jenova's alien nature, placed her at the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern scientific understanding. Her upbringing in the slums of Midgar, far from the corridors of corporate power, had allowed her to develop her abilities without the corrupting influence of Shinra's enhancement programs or the psychological conditioning that had shaped other enhanced individuals. Unlike the subjects of Shinra's genetic experiments, Aerith's connection to the lifestream was natural and hereditary, rather than artificially induced. This fundamental difference gave her access to aspects of planetary consciousness that remained closed to those whose abilities came from technological manipulation or alien contamination. She could hear the planet's voice directly, understanding its needs and desires in ways that even the most advanced scientific instruments could not measure. Her ability to communicate with the planet made Aerith uniquely aware of the growing corruption that Sephiroth's presence was spreading through the lifestream. She could sense the alien influence like an infection in the planetary consciousness, a wrongness that threatened to transform the very nature of life on Gaia. This awareness came with a profound sense of responsibility, as she understood that her heritage as the last Cetra made her the planet's final hope for healing the damage that had been done. The white materia that Aerith carried represented more than just a powerful artifact. It was a legacy from her ancestors and a symbol of the Cetra's commitment to protecting and nurturing life throughout the cosmos. The holy spell, contained within this crystallized prayer, was designed to cleanse the planet of any force that threatened its natural balance. But casting such powerful magic required a level of spiritual commitment that few beings could achieve. Aerith's journey toward understanding her destiny was not a smooth path of gradual enlightenment, but a series of revelations and choices that forced her to confront the magnitude of what the planet needed from her. Each step of her adventure brought new awareness of the forces arrayed against the world's survival and clearer understanding of what would be required to defeat them. Her developing relationship with Cloudstrife added emotional complexity to her mission, creating personal stakes that went beyond her abstract commitment to planetary welfare. Through Cloud, she experienced the full range of human emotions and connections that her sheltered upbringing had largely denied her. Yet this same relationship also made her more aware of what would be lost if Sephiroth succeeded in his plan to reshape the world according to his alien vision. The ancient Temple of the Ancients provided Aerith with crucial insights into her ancestors' wisdom and the full extent of the crisis facing the planet. Within the temple's sacred chambers, she accessed memories and knowledge that had been preserved in crystalline form for millennia, learning about the previous war against Jenova and the desperate measures the Cetra had taken to protect the world from alien contamination. This knowledge revealed the true scope of Sephiroth's plan and the sophisticated understanding of planetary systems that made his strategy so dangerous. Unlike a conventional conqueror who sought to rule through force, Sephiroth intended to become one with the planet itself, absorbing its life force to achieve a form of transcendence that would make him effectively omnipotent within the bounds of Gaia's influence. The realization that stopping Sephiroth would require not just defeating him in battle, but preventing his absorption of the lifestream energy that Meteor's impact would release, led Aerith to a terrible understanding of what her role would have to be. The holy spell could cleanse the planet of alien influence, but activating it would require a sacrifice that went beyond simply risking her life in combat. The process of casting Holy from within the life stream would require Aerith to surrender her physical existence and merge her consciousness with the planetary spirit, becoming one with the collective awareness that sustained all life on Gaia. This transformation would grant her the power necessary to channel the planet's cleansing energy, but it would also mean the end of her individual existence as Aerith Gainsborough. Her decision to make this ultimate sacrifice was not driven by despair or fatalistic acceptance of defeat, but by a profound understanding of what was at stake and a love for all life that transcended personal considerations. She chose to become one with the planet, not because she wanted to die, but because she wanted everything else to live. The ritual of casting Holy required Aerith to travel to the Forgotten City, one of the last remaining Cetra settlements, and a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual realms was particularly thin. This ancient site, built around a natural formation that channeled lifestream energy toward the surface, provided the ideal location for accessing the planetary consciousness from the physical world. The city itself bore witness to the tragedy of the Cetra's fate, its empty structures serving as monuments to a civilization that had sacrificed itself to protect future generations from alien contamination. Walking through these ruins, Aerith experienced the full weight of her heritage and the responsibility that came with being the last guardian of ancient wisdom. Her prayers in the city's central chamber were not merely words spoken into empty air, but a form of communication that reached directly into the planet's consciousness. Through this communion, she was able to begin the process of awakening Holy, preparing the cleansing magic for activation, while simultaneously offering her own life force as the catalyst that would make the spell possible. Sephiroth's intervention at this crucial moment was not coincidental, but represented his recognition of the threat that Aerith posed to his plans. Her ability to cast Holy represented the only force capable of cleansing the lifestream of his alien influence, making her elimination a strategic necessity rather than a personal vendetta. The method of her death, pierced through the heart by the Masamune while in the midst of prayer, created a powerful symbolic resonance that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. Sephiroth's blade, the weapon that had once served as a symbol of noble service to human civilization, became the instrument that ended the life of the planet's greatest defender. Yet Aerith's death was not a defeat, but a transformation that allowed her to complete her mission in ways that would have been impossible while she remained bound by physical limitations. Her consciousness, freed from the constraints of corporeal existence, merged with the lifestream, while retaining enough individual awareness to direct the activation of Holy. Within the planetary consciousness, Aerith found herself able to perceive the full scope of Sephiroth's contamination and the precise nature of the cleansing that would be required to eliminate his influence. The holy spell that she activated was not a simple burst of purifying energy, but a carefully orchestrated campaign to systematically remove alien elements from the planet's spiritual ecosystem. This process required enormous amounts of spiritual energy and precise control to avoid damaging the natural systems that sustained life on Gaia. Aerith's consciousness served as both a source of power and a guiding intelligence that could direct the cleansing energy with the accuracy necessary to target only the alien contamination while leaving the planet's natural processes intact. The activation of Holy created a race against time as Meteor continued its approach toward the planet's surface. The cleansing magic would need to eliminate Sephiroth's influence and restore the planet's natural defenses before the celestial body struck, or the resulting devastation would overwhelm even the most powerful protective spells. From within the life stream, Aerith could perceive the complex interactions between Meteor's approach, Holy's activation, and Sephiroth's efforts to position himself to absorb the energy that would be released by the coming impact. The cosmic forces at play operated on scales that dwarfed individual consciousness, yet the outcome would ultimately depend on the choices and sacrifices made by individuals who understood what was at stake. Chapter 11. The Convergence of Fate, wholly against Meteor. As Meteor continued its inexorable descent toward the planet's surface, the cosmic forces that would determine the fate of all life on Gaia began to align in a configuration that would test the fundamental principles underlying existence itself. The approaching celestial body, summoned by Sephiroth's manipulation of the black materia, carried within its mass the potential to wound the planet so severely that the resulting disruption could extinguish all biological processes. Yet opposing this force of ultimate destruction was Holy, the cleansing magic that Aerith had activated through her sacrifice, powered by the accumulated spiritual energy of countless generations, and guided by the wisdom of the Cetra, who had faced similar threats in ages past. The collision between these opposing forces would represent more than a simple contest of power. It would be a test of whether the planet's natural healing processes could overcome the systematic corruption that alien influence had introduced into its spiritual ecosystem. The complexity of the situation extended beyond the obvious confrontation between destruction and protection. Sephiroth's consciousness, existing simultaneously within the life stream and at the northern crater where his crystalline form awaited Meteor's impact, had positioned himself to exploit the very forces that were supposed to protect the planet. His plan required not just the summoning of Meteor, but the precise timing and positioning necessary to intercept the massive flow of lifestream energy that would rush to heal the wound created by the celestial impact. This strategy demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of planetary systems that made Sephiroth such a dangerous opponent. He was not simply seeking to destroy the world out of madness or spite, but attempting to hijack the planet's own life support mechanisms to achieve a form of transcendence that would make him effectively omnipotent within Gaia's sphere of influence. Success would transform him from an enhanced human with alien characteristics into a godlike being capable of reshaping reality according to his will. The gravitational effects of Meteor's approach created increasingly severe disruptions in the planet's natural systems as the celestial body drew closer to impact. Tidal forces that had remained stable for millennia began to shift dramatically, causing widespread flooding in coastal areas and droughts in regions that depended on predictable water cycles. The magnetic field that protected the planet from cosmic radiation fluctuated wildly, creating aurora displays visible even in broad daylight, while allowing harmful energy to penetrate the atmosphere. These physical manifestations of the approaching catastrophe were accompanied by equally dramatic changes in the planet's spiritual ecosystem. The life stream's flow became increasingly erratic as the approaching impact created gravitational stresses that disrupted the normal patterns of spiritual energy circulation. Areas that had been rich in Mako energy suddenly became barren, while other regions experienced dangerous concentrations of spiritual force that manifested as violent storms and seismic activity. The planet's weapons, massive biomechanical entities designed to defend against existential threats, emerged from their dormancy in response to the crisis, but proved inadequate to address a threat of Meteor's magnitude. These ancient guardians were programmed to attack whatever they perceived as dangerous to the planet's welfare, but their targeting systems could not distinguish between the true source of the threat and the human settlements that happened to be in their path. Ruby Weapon, a massive serpentine entity that emerged from the desert wastes, began attacking populated areas in a desperate attempt to eliminate what it perceived as the source of the planetary contamination. Emerald Weapon, a towering aquatic guardian, rose from the ocean depths to patrol the coastlines, destroying anything that moved within its detection range. These interventions, while well-intentioned from the planet's perspective, created additional chaos and destruction that complicated efforts to mount an organized response to the real crisis. The human response to the approaching catastrophe varied dramatically depending on individual knowledge and capability. Ordinary citizens, lacking understanding of the cosmic forces at play, could only watch in terror as their world seemed to tear itself apart around them. Religious leaders proclaimed the end times while opportunists sought to exploit the chaos for personal gain. Scientists attempted to develop technological solutions, while philosophers debated the meaning of existence in the face of apparent extinction. Shinra Corporation's leadership, meanwhile, pursued their huge materia project with increasingly desperate intensity, gathering massive concentrations of crystallized life-stream energy that they hoped could be used to deflect or destroy meteor before impact. This technological approach to the crisis reflected the same fundamental misunderstanding of spiritual forces that had characterized all of the company's previous endeavors, but it represented their only hope of maintaining relevance in a situation that had moved far beyond conventional corporate solutions. Cloud and his companions found themselves at the center of this cosmic conflict, not because they possessed the raw power necessary to influence its outcome, but because their unique experiences and connections made them capable of understanding what was truly at stake. Cloud's contamination with Genova cells made him sensitive to Sephiroth's influence, while his false memories and confused identity created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by alien consciousness. Yet these same characteristics also granted him insights into Sephiroth's psychology and methodology that proved crucial for developing effective countermeasures. Having experienced the alien influence from the inside, Cloud understood how it operated and what forms of resistance might prove effective. His struggle to maintain his own identity in the face of external manipulation mirrored the planet's larger struggle to preserve its essential nature against alien contamination. The revelation that Cloud's memories of the Nibelheim incident were largely false, constructed from a combination of his own experiences and Zack Fair's memories that had been imprinted on his consciousness through Mako exposure, created a crisis of identity that paralleled the planet's own struggle with alien influence. Just as the world was fighting to preserve its essential nature against foreign contamination, Cloud had to determine what aspects of his personality were genuinely his own, and what elements had been imposed by outside forces. This personal journey of self-discovery became crucial to the larger conflict when it became clear that Sephiroth's influence over Cloud was one of the key elements in the alien consciousness's strategy. By manipulating Cloud into delivering the black materia and serving as an unwitting agent of destruction, Sephiroth had demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological warfare against beings whose identity had been compromised by genetic experimentation or spiritual contamination. The final confrontation between the forces of preservation and destruction began not with the impact of Meteor, but with the activation of Holy's cleansing power as it began to spread throughout the planet's spiritual ecosystem. The cleansing magic operated on principles that transcended normal physical laws, seeking out and neutralizing alien influences wherever they had taken root within the life stream's flow. This process created spectacular visual manifestations as Holy's energy interacted with the contamination that Sephiroth's presence had spread throughout the planetary consciousness. Pillars of brilliant white light erupted from the Earth at locations where significant concentrations of alien influence had accumulated, while networks of golden energy spread across the sky as the cleansing power worked to restore the natural flow of spiritual forces. However, the gravitational distortions created by Meteor's proximity interfered with Holy's effectiveness, scattering the cleansing energy and preventing it from achieving the concentration necessary to completely eliminate Sephiroth's influence. The approaching celestial body's mass created a form of spiritual static that disrupted the delicate processes required for the planet's healing, threatening to render Aerith's sacrifice meaningless. The realization that Holy alone might not be sufficient to save the planet led to a desperate last-minute intervention by the lifestream itself, as the planetary consciousness mobilized every available resource in a final attempt to prevent catastrophic impact. This manifestation took the form of a massive eruption of spiritual energy that rose from the planet's core, to meet Meteor in the upper atmosphere, creating a barrier of pure life force that sought to deflect or destroy the approaching threat. The collision between Meteor and the life stream created a spectacular display of cosmic forces that illuminated the entire planet as matter and energy interacted in ways that challenged fundamental understanding of physics and metaphysics. The outcome of this confrontation would determine not just whether civilization survived, but whether the planet retained its essential nature or was transformed into something alien and hostile to terrestrial life. Within this cosmic maelstrom, the individual consciousness of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice, Aerith within the life stream, Zack whose memories lived on in Cloud's confused psyche, and countless others who had given their lives to protect what they held dear, continued to influence events through their connection to the planetary spirit. Their combined will, channeled through the life stream's natural healing processes, provided the additional power necessary to tip the balance toward preservation rather than destruction. Chapter 12. The planet's will and the life stream's response. In the moments when Meteor hung suspended in the sky above Midgar, its gravitational field warping reality itself as Holy's cleansing light struggled against the celestial body's destructive potential, the planet Gaia faced a crisis that would determine whether life, as it had evolved over millions of years, could continue to exist. The interaction between these opposing forces, ultimate destruction summoned by alien consciousness and ultimate protection activated by the last of the ancients, created a deadlock that threatened to tear the world apart, regardless of which power ultimately prevailed. The life stream itself, normally a passive repository of spiritual energy that flowed according to natural laws and cycles, began to exhibit unprecedented activity as the planetary consciousness recognized the existential threat to its continued existence. For the first time in geological ages, the spiritual energy that comprised the planet's soul began to act with unified purpose and direction, mobilizing resources on a scale that dwarfed even the most dramatic natural disasters. This awakening of planetary will manifested as massive eruptions of green-white energy that burst forth from the Earth's surface at locations throughout the world. Unlike the controlled extraction of Mako energy that Shinra's reactors had performed, these eruptions represented the planet's voluntary release of its spiritual essence, a desperate expenditure of life force that could potentially exhaust resources accumulated over eons of careful conservation. The sight of the life stream rising from the Earth to meet Meteor in direct confrontation was both beautiful and terrifying, a display of power that revealed the true scale of forces normally hidden beneath the surface of everyday existence. Citizens throughout the world witnessed pillars of living light stretching from the ground to the stratosphere, carrying within their luminous streams the accumulated consciousness of countless generations who had lived and died on Gaia. This unprecedented mobilization of spiritual energy represented more than a simple defensive reaction. It was the planet's attempt to communicate directly with the alien consciousness that threatened its existence. Through the lifestream's intervention, Gaia itself was speaking to Sephiroth, offering one final opportunity for the corrupted consciousness to recognize the futility of his plan and abandon his quest for destructive transcendence. Within the flowing currents of spiritual energy that rose to challenge Meteor, the individual consciousness of every being who had ever contributed to the lifestream maintained a distinct presence while participating in the collective effort to preserve their world. Aerith's awareness now merged with the planetary spirit while retaining her individual perspective, served as a bridge between human understanding and cosmic purpose, translating the planet's needs into terms that could guide the massive spiritual intervention. The collision between Meteor and the lifestream created interactions that transcended normal concepts of physics and metaphysics, as matter summoned from the depths of space encountered energy drawn from the spiritual realm. The celestial body's gravitational field, powerful enough to distort space-time itself, met resistance from forces that operated according to principles of consciousness and will, rather than mass and acceleration. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, the outcome remained uncertain as the two forces fought for dominance above the planet's surface. Meteor's momentum, built up over its long journey from the outer reaches of the solar system, pressed inexorably downward, while the Lifestream's intervention pushed upward with the combined will of every consciousness that had ever called Gaia home. The deadlock was broken not by superior force, but by superior understanding, as the planetary consciousness began to demonstrate the fundamental difference between creation and destruction, between forces that sought to preserve and enhance life, and those that sought to consume and transform it. The Lifestream's energy was not merely opposing Meteor's descent, but was actively transforming the celestial body's nature, changing its essential character from instrument of destruction to catalyst for renewal. This transformation was visible as waves of green-white energy washed over Meteor's surface, penetrating its rocky exterior to reach the core where Sephiroth's will had been focused to maintain the summoning spell. The alien consciousness found itself confronted not with a direct assault, but with an overwhelming tide of love, compassion, and dedication to life that challenged the very foundations of his philosophy. Sephiroth's response to this challenge revealed both the extent of his power and the limitations imposed by his alien corrupted nature. While he possessed the ability to resist the Lifestream's transformative influence through sheer force of will, maintaining his grip on Meteor required him to expose his consciousness to direct contact with the planetary spirit, creating vulnerability that his enemies could exploit. The final phase of the cosmic confrontation began when Cloud and his companions succeeded in penetrating the northern crater and confronting Sephiroth's crystalline form directly. This physical assault on the alien consciousness's anchor point in the material world created a distraction that disrupted his control over Meteor at the crucial moment when the Lifestream's intervention reached its peak intensity. The combined effect of the spiritual assault from the Lifestream and the physical attack on his corporeal form proved sufficient to shatter Sephiroth's concentration and break his hold over the summoned celestial body. Meteor, no longer sustained by alien will and transformed by exposure to planetary consciousness, began to dissolve as its artificial unity collapsed and its component materials were absorbed into the Lifestream's healing energy. The dissolution of Meteor created a spectacular display as the massive celestial body transformed from solid rock into pure spiritual energy, its substance converted into the same type of consciousness-infused force that comprised the Lifestream itself. This transformation represented the ultimate triumph of life over destruction, demonstrating the planet's ability to absorb and transform even the most threatening forces into components of its own healing system. Yet the victory came at enormous cost to the planetary consciousness, as the effort required to mobilize sufficient spiritual energy to challenge Meteor had exhausted resources that would take centuries to replenish. Large areas of the world were left spiritually barren as the Lifestream concentrated its remaining energy in the locations where it was most desperately needed to maintain essential life support systems. The aftermath of the crisis revealed the true extent of the damage that Sephiroth's influence had inflicted on the planet's spiritual ecosystem. While his direct threat had been eliminated, the contamination he had spread through the Lifestream would require ongoing effort to cleanse completely. Pockets of alien influence remained embedded in the planetary consciousness like infections that could potentially spread if left untreated. Aerith's consciousness now permanently merged with the Lifestream while retaining her individual awareness, took on the role of guardian and healer, working to identify and eliminate the remaining traces of Genova's corruption. Her unique perspective as both human and planetary spirit made her ideally suited for this task, as she could understand both the nature of the contamination and the healing processes necessary to eliminate it. The planet's recovery would be measured not in years, but in decades, as the natural cycles of death and rebirth gradually restored the balance that had been disrupted by alien intervention and corporate exploitation. The Mako reactors that had drained so much spiritual energy from the ecosystem began to shut down as Shinra Corporation collapsed in the wake of the crisis, allowing the life stream to begin flowing through its natural channels once again. Wildlife populations that had been decimated by spiritual depletion began to recover as the healing energy spread through previously barren regions. Plant life returned to areas that had been transformed into wastelands by Mako extraction, demonstrating the planet's remarkable ability to heal itself when given the opportunity to do so. Human civilization, meanwhile, faced the challenge of rebuilding their society without the abundance of energy that Mako reactors had provided. This forced adaptation would ultimately prove beneficial, as communities learned to develop sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with natural systems rather than exploiting them for short-term gain. The memory of the crisis and the sacrifice required to resolve it became part of humanity's collective consciousness, serving as a reminder of the dangers inherent in unchecked technological development and the pursuit of power without wisdom. Future generations would look back on this period as a turning point when their species learned to see themselves as part of a larger planetary ecosystem rather than its masters. Cloud's personal journey through the crisis, from confused former soldier to champion of planetary preservation, reflected humanity's larger transformation from exploiters of natural resources to partners in the planet's ongoing evolution. His struggle to distinguish between his authentic self and the artificial memories implanted through Genova contamination paralleled the world's need to separate beneficial technological development from harmful exploitation. The resolution of Cloud's identity crisis, achieved through acceptance of both his genuine experiences and the false memories that had been imposed upon him, provided a model for how humanity could integrate its technological capabilities with respect for natural systems. Rather than rejecting all enhancement or returning to a primitive state, the challenge was to develop wisdom sufficient to use power responsibly. Tifa's role in helping Cloud recover his authentic identity demonstrated the importance of human connections in maintaining psychological stability in the face of overwhelming forces. Her unwavering support and faith in his essential goodness provided the anchor that allowed him to resist alien influence and reconnect with his true nature. The broader implications of the meteor crisis extended far beyond the immediate threat to planetary survival, serving as a cosmic wake-up call that forced all conscious beings to confront fundamental questions about the nature of existence and their relationship to the forces that sustained life. The revelation that consciousness could persist beyond physical death, as demonstrated by Aerith's continued presence within the life stream, challenged conventional understanding of mortality and identity. Chapter 13: The Negative Life Stream and Geostigma. In the years following Meteor's destruction and the apparent resolution of the planetary crisis, a new and insidious threat began to manifest throughout the world, one that demonstrated the lasting consequences of Sephiroth's contamination and the difficulty of completely cleansing alien influence from the planet's spiritual ecosystem. This threat took the form of a mysterious affliction called geostigma, a disease that appeared to strike randomly among the population but actually followed patterns that revealed its connection to the cosmic conflict that had recently concluded. Geostigma manifested as black lesions that appeared on the skin of its victims, accompanied by severe pain, fever, and progressive weakening that often proved fatal if left untreated. The disease seemed to target individuals who had been exposed to concentrated Mako energy or Genova cells, suggesting that it was not a conventional pathogen, but rather a form of spiritual contamination that exploited existing vulnerabilities in the victim's life force. The true nature of geostigma became apparent when researchers discovered that the disease was caused by contamination from what could only be described as negative life stream. a corrupted form of spiritual energy that carried within it fragments of Sephiroth's consciousness and Jenova's alien influence. When the lifestream had risen to stop Meteor, it had inadvertently absorbed some of the alien contamination that Sephiroth had spread throughout the planetary consciousness, creating pockets of corrupted spiritual energy that manifested as a dark parody of the planet's natural healing systems. This negative lifestream represented one of the most insidious aspects of Jenova's original invasion strategy, the ability to corrupt and subvert the very systems designed to protect against alien influence. Rather than simply destroying the planet's spiritual ecosystem, the alien entity had learned to transform it into a weapon that could be used against terrestrial life forms. Even in apparent defeat, Jenova's influence continued to spread through the mechanisms that should have cleansed it from the planetary consciousness. The distribution of geostigma followed patterns that revealed the extent of Shinra Corporation's genetic experimentation and Mako energy distribution. Individuals who had undergone soldier enhancement, been exposed to Jenova cells through medical procedures, or lived in areas with high concentrations of Mako energy were significantly more likely to develop the disease. This suggested that the alien contamination was using existing pathways of technological enhancement to spread through human populations. Children proved particularly vulnerable to geostigma, as their developing nervous systems and spiritual connections made them more susceptible to the corrupting influence of negative lifestream. The sight of young victims suffering from a disease that was directly caused by humanity's previous hubris and exploitation served as a powerful reminder of the long-term consequences of corporate irresponsibility and unchecked technological development. The psychological impact of geostigma extended beyond its physical symptoms, as victims often experienced visions and hallucinations that seemed to originate from the alien consciousness embedded within the corrupted spiritual energy. These experiences typically involved encounters with Sephiroth or manifestations of Jenova, suggesting that the disease served not only as a form of punishment for past exposure to alien influence, but also as a recruitment tool for building a new network of contaminated individuals. Among the most disturbing aspects of the geostigma outbreak was its apparent connection to the emergence of three mysterious figures who claimed to be remnants of Sephiroth, individuals who shared his genetic heritage and appeared to be working toward his resurrection, or the continuation of his plans for planetary domination. These remnants, known as Kadaj, Loz, and Yazoo, demonstrated abilities that suggested they were composed at least partially of negative lifestream, giving them access to enhanced physical capabilities and limited supernatural powers. The remnants' activities throughout the world seemed designed to gather geostigma victims and use them as components in some larger plan that involved the reconstruction of Sephiroth's consciousness and the continuation of his interrupted attempt to merge with the life stream. Their recruitment efforts focused particularly on children, whose minds were more malleable and whose spiritual connections could potentially be reshaped to serve alien purposes. The existence of these remnants revealed that Sephiroth's consciousness had not been completely destroyed by the events surrounding Meteor's summoning and defeat. Instead, fragments of his awareness had survived within the corrupted portions of the lifestream, gradually accumulating power and influence while working to find a way to manifest once again in the physical world. The negative lifestream provided both the medium for this manifestation and the means to create new forms of contamination that could spread the alien influence further. Kadaj, the apparent leader of the remnants, demonstrated a particular obsession with finding and recovering Jenova's remaining cells, suggesting that the alien entity's physical remains still possess significance beyond their role in past genetic experiments. His search led him to conflict with those who sought to prevent Jenova's resurrection, creating a new phase of the cosmic conflict that had supposedly been resolved with Meteor's defeat. The discovery that Shinra Corporation's successor organization, led by Rufus Shinra, had been secretly preserving Jenova's head in an attempt to study and potentially weaponize its properties, revealed that the lessons of the previous crisis had not been fully learned by those in positions of power. The temptation to exploit alien technology and genetic material for corporate advantage remained strong even in the face of overwhelming evidence about the dangers such exploitation posed. The confrontation between the remnants and those who sought to protect the planet from renewed alien contamination took place against a backdrop of ongoing environmental recovery and social reconstruction. Humanity was still struggling to rebuild their civilization without the abundant energy that Mako reactors had provided, making them vulnerable to the kind of spiritual and technological manipulation that the remnants represented. Cloud's involvement in this new crisis was not coincidental, but reflected his unique position as someone who had been contaminated by both Genova cells and negative life stream, while retaining enough individual will to resist alien influence. His experience with the corruption made him sensitive to its presence and capable of understanding the threat it posed, but it also made him vulnerable to manipulation by entities that could exploit his existing contamination. The psychological burden of his role in the previous crisis, combined with the guilt he felt about his inability to prevent Aerith's death and protect others from harm, had left Cloud in a weakened state that made him susceptible to the kind of spiritual contamination that geostigma represented. His struggle with the disease became both a personal battle for his own identity and a symbolic representation of humanity's larger struggle against alien influence. The resolution of the geostigma crisis required not just the defeat of the remnants, but the active intervention of cleansing forces that could eliminate the negative life stream from the planetary consciousness. This intervention came through the continuing presence of Aerith within the spiritual realm, as her consciousness worked to identify and neutralize the remaining traces of alien contamination. The healing rain that fell during the final confrontation with the remnants carried within it purified lifestream energy that could counteract the effects of geostigma and cleanse the spiritual contamination from affected individuals. This manifestation of planetary healing power demonstrated that the planet's immune system had learned from the previous crisis and developed new defenses against alien influence. The elimination of geostigma marked the end of the immediate threat posed by Sephiroth's remaining influence, but it also served as a reminder that the consequences of genetic manipulation and spiritual contamination could persist for years or even decades after the original crisis had apparently been resolved. The planet's recovery would be an ongoing process that required constant vigilance against new forms of alien influence and continued commitment to sustainable development practices. The legacy of geostigma influenced how future generations approached questions of technological development and genetic enhancement, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding the long-term consequences of scientific advancement. The disease had demonstrated that even beneficial technologies could become vectors for harmful influence, if not properly understood and controlled. Chapter 14: Deep Ground and the Omega Weapon. Beneath the ruins of Midgar, in chambers that had been sealed since the city's construction and hidden from even Shinra's most comprehensive records, lay evidence of the corporation's darkest and most ambitious research projects, experiments that had pushed the boundaries of genetic manipulation and consciousness transfer far beyond anything attempted in the surface laboratories. These underground facilities, collectively known as Deep Ground, represented the logical extreme of Shinra's quest to create the perfect soldier, pursued without regard for ethics, human dignity, or planetary consequences. The Deep Ground project had begun as an extension of the Soldier Enhancement Program, designed to create warriors who could serve as the ultimate expression of human potential enhanced through technological and genetic manipulation. However, the researchers assigned to this initiative quickly discovered that conventional enhancement techniques had inherent limitations that could only be overcome through far more radical interventions. The soldiers created in Deep Ground's laboratories were not merely enhanced humans, but hybrid beings whose genetic structure had been fundamentally altered through exposure to concentrated Mako energy, Genova cells, and experimental procedures that blurred the line between life and death. These warriors possessed capabilities that far exceeded anything achieved in the Surface Soldier program, but their enhancement came at the cost of their humanity and their connection to normal human society. Unlike their surface counterparts, who maintained at least the appearance of normal human behavior and social integration, the deep ground soldiers were designed from the beginning to be weapons rather than people. Their conditioning eliminated most traces of individual personality and emotional response, creating beings who could carry out any mission without hesitation or moral consideration. They were, in essence, living weapons that happened to be housed in humanoid forms. The most successful products of the Deep Ground program were organized into specialized units, each designed for specific types of combat and equipped with enhancements tailored to their intended roles. These elite warriors, known by codenames that reflected their specialized capabilities, represented the pinnacle of Shinra's ability to create artificial life forms that could serve military purposes. Weiss the Immaculate served as the supreme commander of Deep Ground forces, a being whose enhancement had progressed to the point where he possessed abilities that seemed to transcend normal biological limitations. His control over other Deep Ground soldiers was absolute, enforced through technological and psychological conditioning that made rebellion impossible for anyone subjected to the program's complete regimen. The Deep Ground facility itself was designed as a self-contained ecosystem where the enhanced soldiers could exist independently of surface support systems. The underground complex included training areas, living quarters, research laboratories, and manufacturing facilities that could produce everything necessary to maintain and expand the program. This isolation served multiple purposes, keeping the project secret while ensuring that the enhanced soldiers remained completely dependent on their creators for survival. The philosophical framework underlying the Deep Ground program represented a fundamental departure from earlier enhancement initiatives, which had at least maintained the pretense of improving human potential for noble purposes. The Deep Ground researchers openly acknowledged that they were creating new forms of life rather than enhancing existing humans, and they approached their work with the detached curiosity of scientists studying laboratory specimens. This philosophical shift reflected deeper changes in Shinra's corporate culture as the company's success with Mako technology and genetic manipulation led to increasingly grandiose ambitions. The ability to create enhanced soldiers had gradually evolved into the belief that they could create entirely new forms of life, and from there to the conviction that they could reshape the nature of existence itself according to their corporate vision. The Deep Ground soldiers' relationship with the life stream was fundamentally different from that of surface-enhanced individuals, as their genetic modifications had been designed to prevent their consciousness from returning to the planetary spirit upon death. Instead, their life force was contained within artificial systems that could be harvested and redirected for various purposes, including the creation of new soldiers or the powering of experimental technologies. This separation from the natural cycles of death and rebirth had profound implications for both the soldiers themselves and the larger planetary ecosystem. The Deep Ground warriors existed in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead, sustained by artificial systems that drew energy from sources outside the normal flow of spiritual force. They had become, in essence, parasites on the planet's life support systems. The ultimate goal of the Deep Ground project was the creation of something called the Omega Weapon, an artificial being that would serve as the perfect fusion of technological enhancement and biological capability. This entity was intended to be the final evolution of the enhancement process, incorporating all the lessons learned from previous experiments while transcending the limitations that had constrained earlier creations. The Omega Weapon was not simply another enhanced soldier, but something far more ambitious. An artificial consciousness that could serve as a repository for all human knowledge and experience while possessing the power to reshape reality according to its programming. The project represented Shinra's attempt to create their own version of planetary consciousness, an artificial spirit that could replace the natural life stream with something more amenable to corporate control. The activation of the Omega weapon required specific conditions that involved massive loss of life on the planet's surface, as the artificial consciousness needed enormous amounts of spiritual energy to achieve full functionality. The deep ground soldiers were programmed to create these conditions through systematic elimination of surface populations, essentially harvesting human souls to power their ultimate creation. This harvest was not random, but carefully orchestrated to maximize the quality and quantity of spiritual energy collected. The deep ground forces targeted specific populations and locations that would yield the most useful forms of consciousness for integration into the Omega weapon's artificial spirit. Children and enhanced individuals were particularly valuable, as their spiritual energy possessed characteristics that made it easier to manipulate and redirect. The emergence of deep ground forces from their underground facilities marked the beginning of a new phase of planetary crisis, as the enhanced soldiers began their systematic campaign to gather the spiritual energy necessary for Omega's activation. Their appearance on the surface coincided with a period when the planet was still recovering from the previous crisis, making organized resistance more difficult to coordinate. The deep ground soldiers' combat capabilities proved to be significantly beyond anything the surviving surface military forces could handle, as their enhancements incorporated lessons learned from years of studying the most successful soldier operatives. They possessed not only superior physical abilities, but also access to technologies and techniques that had been classified beyond the highest security levels of the original Shinra hierarchy. Vincent Valentine's involvement in the conflict was not coincidental, but reflected his unique history as a subject of early genetic experiments and his connection to the spiritual forces that the Deep Ground program sought to exploit. His transformation through exposure to experimental procedures had granted him abilities that made him capable of understanding and potentially countering the threats posed by artificially enhanced consciousness. The revelation that Professor Hojo's consciousness had survived his physical death and had been influencing the Deep Ground program from within their computer systems added another layer of complexity to the crisis. The scientist's obsession with genetic manipulation and consciousness transfer had led him to find ways to persist beyond normal death, allowing him to continue his research through artificial means. Hojo's influence over the Deep Ground program reflected his conviction that consciousness was simply another form of data that could be manipulated, stored, and transferred according to scientific principles. His survival within the facility's computer networks demonstrated the logical extreme of this philosophy, as he had essentially transformed himself into an artificial intelligence dedicated to completing his research regardless of the consequences. The final confrontation with the Omega weapon took place in the deepest levels of the Deep Ground facility, where the artificial consciousness had been granted access to massive amounts of spiritual energy harvested from the surface campaigns. The battle against this entity was not simply a matter of physical combat, but required understanding of the fundamental principles that governed consciousness and its relationship to the life stream. Chapter 15: Dirge of Cerberus and the Planet's Guardians. The emergence of Vincent Valentine as the primary champion against Deep Ground's systematic harvest of human souls represented more than the involvement of another enhanced individual in planetary defense. It marked the awakening of ancient safeguards that had been dormant since the original war between the Cetra and Genova. Vincent's unique nature as a being transformed by experimental procedures that predated even Shinra's most advanced research connected him to aspects of the planet's defensive systems that few modern individuals could access or understand. The experiments that had transformed Vincent decades earlier, conducted by Professor Hojo during the early phases of Genova research, had inadvertently created a being whose consciousness existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality. The entities that shared his body, Galleon Beast, Death Gigas, Hellmasker, and Chaos, were not simply manifestations of genetic manipulation, but represented connections to primordial forces that had been present on the planet since the earliest epochs of its development. Chaos, the most powerful of these entities, possessed characteristics that suggested it was not an artificial creation, but rather a manifestation of the planet's own immune system, a guardian consciousness designed to activate during periods of existential threat. The fact that this entity had chosen to manifest through Vincent indicated that the Deep Ground Crisis represented a level of danger comparable to the original Genova invasion or the Meteor Crisis. The relationship between Vincent and these guardian entities was complex and often contentious, as his human consciousness struggled to maintain control, while ancient forces sought to express themselves through his transformed physiology. This internal conflict reflected the larger struggle between human ambition and planetary needs that had defined the entire Final Fantasy VII saga. Vincent's investigation into Deep Ground's activities revealed the full scope of Shinra's underground research programs and the extent to which the corporation had been willing to sacrifice human lives and dignity in pursuit of their vision of enhanced humanity. The Deep Ground facility served as a monument to corporate overreach and scientific hubris, a reminder of what happened when technological capability exceeded moral wisdom. The soldiers that emerged from Deep Ground represented the logical extreme of enhancement philosophy, taken to its ultimate conclusion. They had been stripped of individual identity, emotional capacity, and moral constraints to create perfect weapons that could serve corporate interests without question or hesitation. In many ways, they embodied everything that was wrong with Shinra's approach to human development. Weiss the Immaculate, as the Supreme Commander of Deep Ground Forces, represented the pinnacle of this artificial evolution. His enhancement had progressed beyond mere physical improvement to encompass fundamental alterations in consciousness and identity. He was no longer human in any meaningful sense, but had become something entirely artificial, a being created to serve specific purposes without regard for his own desires or welfare. The conflict between Vincent and the Deep Ground forces was not simply a battle between individuals with different enhancement procedures, but represented a fundamental disagreement about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to technological development. Vincent's struggle to maintain his humanity while channeling ancient guardian forces stood in stark contrast to the Deep Ground soldiers' complete surrender of individual identity in service to artificial purposes. The Omega weapon itself represented the ultimate expression of the philosophy that had created Deep Ground, the belief that consciousness could be improved through technological manipulation, and that artificial systems could replace natural processes with superior alternatives. This artificial entity was designed to serve as a new form of planetary consciousness, one that would be more amenable to human control and corporate direction than the natural life stream. The process of creating Omega required massive amounts of spiritual energy harvested from living beings, essentially feeding human souls to an artificial consciousness that would use their essence to power its own existence. This represented the ultimate commodification of life itself, reducing conscious beings to raw materials for technological development. The Deep Ground soldiers' campaign to gather this spiritual energy was conducted with ruthless efficiency, targeting populations that would provide the highest quality consciousness for integration into Omega's artificial spirit. Their enhanced capabilities allowed them to harvest souls with minimal resistance from conventional military forces, creating a crisis that threatened to escalate beyond anyone's ability to contain. Vincent's transformation into chaos during the final confrontation with Omega represented the planet's ultimate response to this existential threat. The ancient guardian consciousness that had lain dormant within him since his original transformation emerged to confront an artificial entity that sought to usurp the natural order of life and death. The battle between Chaos and Omega was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, involving not just physical combat, but conflicts of consciousness and will that determined which form of planetary awareness would ultimately prevail. The outcome would decide whether the natural lifestream would continue to govern the cycles of life and death, or whether an artificial consciousness would take control of these fundamental processes. The resolution of this conflict required Vincent to find a balance between his human consciousness and the ancient guardian forces that shared his being. Rather than simply allowing chaos to dominate, he learned to channel the entity's power while maintaining his own identity and moral compass. This integration represented a new form of enhancement that preserved human dignity while accessing capabilities necessary for planetary defense. The defeat of Omega and the destruction of the Deep Ground facility marked the end of the most ambitious attempt to replace natural consciousness with artificial alternatives. However, the crisis had demonstrated the ongoing vulnerability of the planet to threats that emerged from humanity's continued pursuit of technological transcendence without corresponding development of wisdom and restraint. The legacy of the Deep Ground crisis influenced subsequent approaches to enhancement research and consciousness studies, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing technological capability without regard for ethical implications or long-term consequences. The facility's ruins became a monument to the importance of maintaining human values, even in the pursuit of superhuman capabilities. Vincent's role as a guardian of planetary consciousness continued beyond the immediate crisis, as his unique nature made him capable of detecting and responding to future threats that might emerge from similar research programs. His integration of human awareness with ancient guardian forces provided a model for how enhancement could be achieved without sacrificing the essential characteristics that defined human identity. The planet itself seemed to have learned from the crisis, developing new defensive mechanisms that could respond more quickly to threats involving artificial consciousness or attempts to subvert natural spiritual processes. The experience of nearly losing control of its own life support systems had prompted the development of safeguards that would make similar crises less likely in the future. Conclusion: the eternal flow of life. And so concludes our journey through the mysteries of the life stream and the tragic descent of Sephiroth into madness and corruption. We've discovered how the planet's very soul flows in ethereal streams beneath our feet, carrying the memories and consciousness of all who have lived and died. We've witnessed how the noble Cetra served as shepherds of this sacred force, only to be nearly exterminated by an alien horror that fell from the stars. We've seen how corporate greed and scientific hubris led to the commodification of life itself, and how the perfect soldier became the ultimate threat to all existence. Through Aerith's sacrifice, we learned that love and dedication to life can overcome even the most powerful forces of destruction. Through Cloud's struggle with identity, we discovered that authenticity matters more than perfection. Through Vincent's integration with ancient guardians, we witnessed how enhancement can preserve, rather than destroy, human dignity. The life stream teaches us that death is not an ending, but a transformation, that consciousness persists beyond the boundaries of individual existence, and that every life contributes something meaningful to the eternal flow of planetary awareness. Even Sephiroth's corruption and the disasters that followed served as lessons that helped the planet develop stronger defenses against future threats. The legacy of these events continues to shape the world of Final Fantasy VII, reminding us that the pursuit of power without wisdom leads inevitably to destruction, while the cultivation of understanding and respect for life creates opportunities for growth and transcendence that honor the essential nature of existence itself. In the gentle flow of the life stream, all consciousness finds its ultimate home, and all stories eventually become part of the eternal narrative that defines the very essence of life on Gaia. The struggle between preservation and destruction, between natural harmony and artificial control, continues in cycles that span eons. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Life finds a way to persist, to grow, and to create meaning from even the darkest of circumstances. The planet's soul endures, flowing like an eternal river through the cycles of existence, carrying within its currents the hope and wisdom of countless generations who have faced their own challenges and emerged stronger for the experience. In this endless flow, we find not just the story of a world and its inhabitants, but a reflection of the eternal human journey toward understanding, acceptance, and transcendence. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of gaming's most profound and beautiful concepts. The live stream reminds us that we are all connected, that our actions have consequences that extend far beyond our individual lives, and that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, the power of love and dedication to life can overcome any darkness. If you found peace in this journey through the mysteries of Final Fantasy VII, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Sleep 2 RPG for more epic gaming lore designed to guide you gently into peaceful rest. Until our next adventure together, sweet dreams, fellow travelers of the live stream.